Welcome, everyone. This is your friend here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Tony Stark became the world's greatest threat? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. There were a few times when each of the Avengers learned just how lucky they were to have a certain teammate on their side. They realized how brutal Thor could act when Bruce was trapped under falling rubble, just after he had changed back. It was not a moment after the shifting rebar and concrete collapsed did Thor rush forward, wielding Mjolnir with such precision, and with such effect that not 12 jackhammers could recreate. Then, from a horrific show of strength, he pulled Bruce's unconscious form from the rubble with care that led one to believe he held a newborn baby. From the gentleness he had suddenly given, he turned to rage, the skies rolling black as he faced the terrorist group who dared to challenge he. Tony had risen into the air, ready to help with the fight. However, he could do nothing, as if by a freak natural disaster. Dozens of lightning bolts rained from the sky, each striking who Thor turned his gaze on, a few striking a few stronger members twice, just to make sure they stayed down. He looked at them, a pile of smoking bodies, before turning and marching away, obviously still upset with Bruce's treatment, leaving the others to follow behind like helpless puppies. The event still caused slight discomfort within the group, thinking to what was a god's fury, then to the same god, attempting to fit 3 waffles inside his mouth at one time, including varying condiments from whipped cream to maraschino cherries just because he could. Few tried to remember that event. An even worse event that showed just how lethal Natasha was when 10 assassins from Russia arrived, male and females, experts in areas of acrobatics that even Clint didn't know. Apparently, they were trained from a young age to take down her, only her, as she had left her previous payers quite displeased with her work. They watched, Clint telling them to back away from her own fight, as she took on all 10 at one time, killing them in ways ranging from tripping them off a building, breaking their neck with her legs, or simply shooting them between the eyes. What made it much more impressive was the fact that the entire fight was finished just over 10 minutes. A minute, 60 seconds per assassin. After the whole ordeal, she had simply turned, avoiding anyone's eye, and wandered off, leaving the others to linger around the site as S.H.I.E.L.D. cleaned up the bodies, then retreat to the tower and lounge around until Natasha returned later that night, or the next morning to be accurate. Clint's was by accident. They had watched his long after the event, by a police camera located on a side of a bank in Iowa. He had been on a mission, walking on the opposite side of a crowded street of his target, keeping just behind him as he pulled his jacket just a little closer to keep him slightly warmer. He had no bow on him, having to stay undercover and out of sight, and he was doing how he normally did, excellent, when hands grabbed him, forcing him into a nearby alley while 2 people slammed him into the gum-covered wall. He blinked in surprise, better eyesight adapting faster than a normal human's, as he quickly looked over the 2 thugs who held him, eyes blinking in surprise as a name clicked to the long bony face, accompanied by a more chubby one with a distinct birthmark covering the corner of his right eyebrow. "Give us all your money," the bony one cried out, voice oddly high-pitched for a man in his years, the other one grunting as if to add to the threat. Clint looked at the 2, spy training vanishing suddenly in surprise as he looked at the 2, hardly registering the fact that there was a knife pressed to his throat, not his jugular, might he add. "You Duke? Rex?" Clint gasped out, the 2 guys stumbling backwards and looking at Clint with suspicion as they now held the blades up, 8-inch-long hunting blades. "We lost those names when we were kids. Who are you?" The high-pitched voice of Duke asked back, sunken eyes looking at Clint intently. "Maybe some kid from the orphanage, boss?" Rex grunted out, voice deeper than wrestlers as his throat wiggled with the words. "Yeah, I think I know you." Duke sneered, using his knife to point. Clint remembered these 2, oh yes, the 2 JRKs that attacked him and Barney, part of the driving factor why he ran away. But now? Living off the streets in a whole new town? "I remember you. You that kid who ran off and joined the circus?" Duke sneered, falling into raspy laughter as his knife moved up and down with his heaving. "Should we mug him, boss?" Rex grumbled, looking at the 2, unsure. "Nah, we got him and that Othar kid when we little. Let get him now." Duke laughed, but Rex tilted his head, looking at Clint, who now had several weapons within a second's movement. "Hi boss. Look at his shoes and stuff. He all those fancy folk," Rex called out, causing Duke to narrow his eyes as he looked at him. "Yeah wait, I've seen Befree now. He was on that telly in the window. He w Jabao now," Duke called out, finally remembering before pressing his knife back to Clint's throat, snickering and showing several orange-colored teeth with odd black spots on them. "You workin' with those super folk. Oh, you've got lot of money on ya?" Duke laughed, looking pointedly towards the pockets off his windbreaker. "The proper word is Avengers." Clint threw back, the two noticing how his words seemed more complete. "You learn that bow at Circus?" Duke snickered, dragging the knife around Clint's exposed chin before meeting his eyes. "Partially, the government found special use for me," Clint responded coldly, remembering what these goons weren't afraid to do. "Oh, listen here boss. He's one of politicians," Rex spoke, Duke laughing in unison with Rex, before the dragging knife tip found something on Clint's upper arm. "Why here?" he asked, ripping the sleeve off with a few messy slices, before pulling out the pistol and dropping it like it was a burning coal. "He got a gun on him." "A gun? He one of os killer people?" Duke shouted, and Clint glanced at the entrance to the alleyway, hoping nobody saw. "You're right. I am an assassin," Clint stonily stated blandly, looking with slight satisfaction the look of fear on the two, before pulling out two guns from an area the two were befuddled by and quickly took aim before taking aim and squeezing the trigger, resulting in a small clicking noise. "If I ever catch you mugging, raping, attacking, hell, even stealing anybody, I won't hesitate to blow your brains out, Duke, Rex?" Clint growled, eyes and face showing only seriousness, and the two quickly scampered, leaving Clint sighing at the ripped sleeve of his jacket. On the security footage the others watched, it looked much more impressive. X-X. The Hulk was scary all the time. One didn't have a reason to trust it unless it trusted you first. Steve was kind-hearted, nice and gentle, and at times, it was strong to think of him doing anything that could risk the team. Stark was similar, always joking and throwing witty insults around without care. Most of the time, the only thing that could hurt anybody about him were his defective weapons on the suit. And right now, nobody was buying it. Stark? Dangerous? "I don't think he could be dangerous, Director," Clint scoffed, leaning back in his seat and crossing his arms, balancing on the back two legs of his chair. "I agree, Stark doesn't even hurt our foes that bad." Steve shrugged in his seat, looking at Fury. "You'd be surprised, Agent?" Fury grumbled, slapping a file on the table, just at an angle to allow Clint to read Tony's name on the cover. "Tony doesn't seem like the dangerous type," Bruce warily stated, looking at Folder as if it would lunge up and bite him, or at least take a few fingers off of him. "Bruce is right, Tony doesn't seem hostile," Natasha stated, looking at Fury with a well-hidden confused mask. "That's because he isn't hostile yet," Fury clarified, causing everyone to look at him. "You've lost me," Clint stated, summing up everyone's thoughts. Fury pushed the folder over the table, letting it slide to a halt right in front of Bruce, who frowned but slipped it open, taking out the sheet of paper off of the top of the pile. "Tony Stark statistics page? Cage 34-34? Ha, looks like you're the youngest Cap." Clint smirked, looking at Steve who looked slightly disgruntled. "Date of BRH, May 9th, recruitment for Avengers, yes. What's so wrong with this?" Bruce frowned, looking up at Fury with a frown. "Read the side notes." Fury nodded, causing Bruce to look back down once more. Side notes: Tony Stark does not cooperate well on a team as well as taking orders from others. "Don't we know that?" Natasha muttered under her breath. "He shows signs of lack of self-regard. Friend Stark did take the weapon into the portal." Thor agreed, causing a few nods around the tables. "And is a possible danger to others." "Okay, I see the point here, but why else am I mental?" "What? Who put this up here?" Bruce blinked in surprise, causing Steve to look at him in alarm. "Stark is mental?" "No, it's a category. Mental status, unstable." "Unstable? What does that mean?" Bruce frowned, and Fury slid another paper across, a medical file. Okay, Mr. Stark has refused therapists and psychologists on multiple occasions. Assumed post-traumatic amnesia. Suffers from PTSD. What? When did he get PTSD? Bruce gasped, looking up in alarm. Fury managed to frown, Natasha mirroring it. Friend Banner, what is this PTSD you speak of? Thrust, confused. It's an illness after you see something really bad, and you get flashbacks, nightmares, all that stuff. Clint tried to clarify, causing Steve's eyes to flash in recognition. It's when you see or have gone through a traumatic experience, but Tony never showed any signs of having PTSD. Bruce argued, looking at Fury, who lifted one eyebrow and crossed his arms. You mean you haven't looked for the signs, Dr. Banner? Tell me, does Stark startle often, doesn't focus, doesn't fall asleep, or when he does, have nightmares? Tell me, when did you ever see Stark swimming? Or even near a pool? Fury growled, causing Steve's eyes to widen slightly and jaw click shut. He's had bad memories of water? Did he almost drown or something? Clint frowned, looking at Natasha, who stiffened suddenly as her eyes narrowed. Tasha? He asked quizzically, and she looked at them with a regretful look. Pepper mentioned a little how Stark was taken captive and tortured. Waterboarding, Bruce stated numbly, causing Steve to look slightly horrified before Bruce looked back down at the paper. There's more diagnosed narcissism. What? Bruce blinked, staring at the sheet and growing slightly pale. You see why Stark can be dangerous? Fury nodded, causing even more confusion. Wait, I've heard of it in the passing. What is narcissism exactly? Clint asked, the legs of his chair setting down as Bruce swallowed. It's a mental disorder dash. Knew Stark was messed up in the head, just not this bad. Steve muttered under his breath. Bruce ignored it and continued on. It's an illness in the way one judges self, causing them to be self-absorbed. Bruce swallowed, not wanting to look at the paper that stared mockingly the results. Why is that bad? We all know Stark is self-absorbed. Clint smiled, trying to lighten the mood slightly from the previous downcast feeling. There's more than one type of narcissism, Clint. Natasha sighed, rubbing her eyes. What but? She means that S.H.I.E.L.D. is afraid that he's going to develop aggressive narcissism. Bruce sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. We don't know what that means, Bruce. Steve muttered after a slightly awkward silence, and Bruce sighed, caring to delve deeper. It entitles one to superficial charm, a killer ego, constant lying, lack of remorse and guilt, lack of empathy, manipulative, and failure to accept responsibilities. Bruce sighed, looking upright and the others going quiet. Oh, that would be bad. Clint muttered, but Thor frowned. How is one sure that friend Stark has this illness? There are the 7 symptoms Natasha started, apparently having looked it up. Having no shame, thinking oneself is perfect, being arrogant, constant envy, special treatment, exploitation of others without caring for feelings, and having bad boundaries or limits. Natasha prattled off, each Avenger having a sicker feeling in their gut. So you're saying that if Stark wasn't on our side, he could be a Loki? Clint deadpanned and Fury sighed, looking away. To be honest, Stark is a weapon genius. He has a thinking pattern that makes him unpredictable. He hides his emotions in such way that even S.H.I.E.L.D. cannot predict his next move. Fury growled, rubbing his one good eye, showing how tired he actually was. Director, if we were ever to fight Stark, what would our chances be? Steve asked quietly, causing Fury to look up with a grim smile. If we were at war against a single man? How do you think we would do, Rogers? Steve shifted in his seat, thinking about the past, the ideas and thoughts. Howard had been smart, and if Tony was just as smart, he would be a tricky foe. I don't think we would win unscathed. Captain, if we were ever to fight Stark, our chances would be less than you single-handedly fighting Loki. That's impossible, Stark's only one man. Clint added, frowning at how the situation turned. A single man with a mental illness, PTSD, and an IQ rivaling Einstein's. Bruce muttered, causing Steve to frown. After Stark escaped from the 10 rings, he slaughtered every single one, destroying the entire group. Natasha stated, causing Steve to stiffen slightly and Clint to look up in surprise. He killed an entire terrorist group? The ones that captured him before? He didn't give them to the authorities? Bruce choked out, looking slightly sick. Bannert, he killed a total of 212 men in less than 4 hours. Natasha clarified, and Steve now was unsure. This man was on his team? You asked what would happen in war against him? Fury asked, leaning back with a frown before narrowing his eye on Steve. Stark has contacts, money, brains, people working for him, and is as impossible to get rid of as a wart. He sighed, a slight twitch of the lips showing a grim smile. Captain, if we were ever against Stark, there wouldn't be a fight, we'd be dead already. Tony Stark was many things, arrogant, stuck up, rather cocky of himself, but one thing he wasn't, was blind. So, after the rest of the gang returned to the Avengers Tower, he wasn't oblivious to the stares they gave him when they thought he wasn't looking. Did Fury rant on about him, because he was stuck fixing his armor from the last battle? Even if his armor was fixed, he still probably would have ignored Fury's call and sat back in the lab, tinkering on a toaster Thor had managed to melt again. But as he walked around the kitchen, scanning the shelves for any sort of food to help him create a sandwich, part of his mind took count of how quiet the room got from what he previously heard in the hallway. He grabbed a small packet of cold cuts before taking the desired slices of bread and pretending to be occupied as he briefly watched them out of the corner of his eyes, wondering why they suddenly seemed so paranoid. Once spreading the appropriate amount of sliced turkey did Tony look up again, briefly meeting Clint's eyes, who looked down once more. He didn't miss the way Clint's hand moved ever so slightly towards his back, where Tony suspected he and Natasha hid guns. As for a glance would impose such threat that a gun needed to be involved confused Tony. So he decided to push it. He grabbed his plate with the sandwich and walked over, hopping the back of the couch while setting his feet up on the coffee table, eyebrows lifting questioningly while Clint and Steve tensed suddenly. Get your feet off the table, Stark? Natasha scowled, Tony rolling his eyes at her before taking an exaggerated bite and keeping his feet firmly on the table. Bruce had given a small sigh of relief, obviously one that Tony was not supposed to hear. It wasn't something that concerned him, but it obviously led to confusion once again. So, what did old Nicky want this time? Tony smirked, smile faltering slightly as he noticed the slightly fearful faces. Whoa, Loki didn't escape, right? I really don't want to deal with him again. Tony groaned, plate abandoned on the table as he collapsed back into the couch, pillows muffling his impact. Nay, friend Stark, my brother has not escaped. Thor boomed back, trying his best to sound normal, but by the way, Tony's eyes narrowed slightly, he knew it was hopeless. So why does it look like you all just ran over a puppy? Tony asked, eyebrows lifting as he glanced at everyone, eyes resting on a scowling Natasha. You have a morbid imagination, Stark. Fury wanted us to go over recent events and property damage relating to our last battle. She sighed, and Clint snorted on her other side. Hey, in my defense, those aliens were tough. They were 2 feet tall, Stark. Clint muttered, causing Natasha to smirk victorious as Tony grumbled and grabbed the empty plate, walking towards the dishwasher. So why were you there, Big Green? You weren't there during the battle. Tony pointed out, noticing the way Bruce stiffened, and how the others gave a pointed look. Fury wanted me to find out how those aliens were able to eat metal. Turns out they just have really strong teeth. He gave a weak laugh, rubbing the back of his head at the base of his neck. Liar, so is it something I can add to the suit? Teeth dust? Tony grinned, noticing how Bruce relaxed, thinking he hadn't caught his obvious lie. I don't think so. Once separated, it's too fragile to hold up on its own before crumbling. Bruce sighed, Tony giving a fake frustrated sigh before hopping over, Steve ignoring his eye. Did you repair your suit from the attack? Natasha asked, and Tony sighed. I practically had to make a new one. It's not like I can just fix an entire leg. He nodded, holding up a mug of coffee to show the others before making his way towards the stairs to his underground lab. I'm building, don't bug me unless it's been 3 days or something's on fire. Tony called back, ignoring Bruce's sound of protest on how 3 days isn't healthy Tony, and walked down the stairs, door automatically SWNG open before he had to punch in a code. Walking in and spinning around on his stool, he glanced at the many clean-topped counters before dragging his hand over the surface, holograms glowing into existence. But he hesitated, just about to bring up the blueprints for the damage his suit had taken, trying to figure out a way to control the suit without access to his left leg. "Jarvis, bring up live feed from the living room," Tony commanded at once, taking a sip of coffee as Jarvis responded, bringing up the camera feed. Tony watched with a slight frown as the group was silent, before muted lips began to move on Natasha, eyes slightly downcast. "Jarvis sound?" Tony nodded, taking another sip. "D for him. You heard Fury, he may be out of his mind, but he has shown no signs." Thor boomed, Tony wincing and Jarvis turning down the sound from the single statement. "Are they talking about reindeer games, Jarvis?" Tony frowned, confused as to why he wouldn't be included with the conversation. "Inconclusive, sir." "Perfect." Tony sighed, kicking back to watch the tense group continue with their conversation. "Doesn't mean he can't snap." Clint had muttered under his breath, eyes briefly flickering up towards the camera before freezing with a wide-eyed look. Tasha, there's Jarvis." Clint cursed, jumping to his feet in alarm, causing Tony to spin around, grabbing something to help with his fixing of the toaster. "Jarvis, can you tell us if Stark has an open video feed of us all?" Bruce asked, and Tony spun around, alarmed. "Don't you dare, Jarvis," he threatened, and Jarvis seemed to hesitate before answering. "My apologize, Dr. Banner. Mr. Stark is currently repairing a toaster Mr. Odinson managed to melt. Shall I send a message to him?" "No, that's fine, Jarvis. Thanks." Bruce sighed, looking away in relief, just as Tony let out a matching sigh. "Thanks, Jarvis, you're the best." "You're welcome, sir. X-X. A little help here," Tony shouted through the comms, twisting in the air to avoid the intent robots that chased his heels. Static came through on the intercom before the fizzled voice of Steve answered his shout. "We're a little busy here, Stark," leaving him to his own panicked thoughts. "Well, not too panicked. Jarvis, how close are they?" he shouted, twisting to the left to avoid a sudden street sign which close lined one of his following friends. "My scanners indicate there are at least 6 tracking you. How are they keeping up?" he shouted back, twisting and turning the other way. 2 collided in a small fiery explosion, which sent off quite a few car alarms. "The 4 remaining drones are equipped with scanning technology, as my sensors indicate. They seem to have a tracking guidance system, sir. Any chance of scrambling the heat signature?" He grit out from between his teeth as he twisted, loosing another one in the side of a building, almost groaning as 2 more joined the fray, creating the original 6 once more. "Negative, sir. They seem to be using a visually lock onto your form." "Sheet. A visual lock? Only I use those. CRP. Incoming projectile on your left side." "I know," Tony shouted, turning suddenly and letting the released missile slam into one of the robots, sending it flying back into the others with a large plume of rancid black smoke. Only 3 of the annoying little robots dared to follow through. "Catch me if you can, soup cans." Tony snickered, shooting up into the air while releasing a few rounds of bullets, which scraped the 2, but jabbed deeply into the 3rd, causing it to smoke and plummet quickly towards the ground below. "Stark, what do you want, Cap?" "I'm in the middle of something." Tony gritted through his teeth, watching as the clouds steadily grew closer and closer. "There's an incoming giant of a robot dash." "How big?" Tony grunted out, noticing several displays that showed where the altitude was harming his already hurt suit. "Helicopter size." "On my way." Tony sighed, flaring out wings before turning and diving in a free fall, shooting past the 2 drones, which turned to follow him again. He grit his teeth, briefly seeing Thor near another rooftop, sending drones flying with each swipe of his hammer, Natasha below, shooting in sync with Clint, whose many arrows stuck out of enemy visors. Tony did see the giant machine that Steve was talking about, slightly larger than a helicopter, the body a mix between a hippo and a spider, gears and pipes creating rusty pipes while large headlights glowed a creepy red to mimic eyes. "Oh, that's the big deal." Tony muttered, the thing turning and letting out a roar in his general direction. Thick black exhaust blew from the pipes in its teeth, muffling its head for a moment before it cleared, glaring and starting to lift one of its 8 legs. "Jarvis, are there any weak points?" Tony shouted, dodging left while the fat rusty leg took a swipe at him. Scans are inconclusive, sir. Fine. Take them when I get closer. He shouted, blasting forward and across the thing's back, taking a few test shots over the outer shell of the thing, avoiding the legs as it stomped in anger as he managed to tweak a few pipes and gears from its back. Stark, get back. Your attack isn't working. Steve shouted, and Tony scoffed inside his suit. Steve thought he was attacking? That was preposterous. I see that, Cap. Tony grunted back, swerving left to avoid clamping gears and pipes that made up the monster's mouth. Regroup. We need a plan. I've got a plan. Attack. Tony immediately responded, eyes flickering over the screens that the close-up scans had shown for the giant. Okay, hollow inside, furnace located in the Cestian skull. What? Only 3 locks holding the legs in place. Tony scoffed, changing direction and quickly firing a blast at one of its 8 legs. The beast groaned, turning and glaring with red eyes as more smoke poured from its mouth. Stark, I've got this. He shouted back, opening the feed to all of his teammates before firing one more at the same leg, allowing the blast to snap the joint next to the body before he blasted down, grabbing the leg itself before it had enough momentum to collapse. Sir, power levels are not high enough for a continuous hold. Can we leech from this thing? Tony grunted back, trying to pull himself back up the uneven ground of the monsters constantly moving and shifting back. Of course, sir. Connection must be created at the nearest platform. Getting there, Jarvis? Tony grunted, metal of its severed leg caving in as his hands dug in harder for a better grip, and slowly he dragged a foot up, advancing up the back of the thing. He briefly noticed other smaller drones and how the ones that had been chasing him were shot down, but now, dragging a gigantic leg up the side of rusty bolts and glue seemed incredibly strong. Jarvis, can you redirect the thrusters into suction? He grunted, taking another step backwards and dragging the leg with a loud shrieking noise. Negative, sir. The thrusters would not be able to handle the stress. Perfect dash, she gasped, feet digging in harder as the beast shifted, spinning to try and throw him off. If I may suggest so, sir. Perhaps you should use the attachment as a form of traction? Tony could have hit himself for his stupidity. He turned, grabbing the leg further down and throwing it up, grinning under the helmet as the sharp tip of the leg pierced the thick armor of rust and corroding copper. The beast howled, steam and smoke bursting out of its mouth, severed leg stump, and the hole in its back. Stark, what are you doing? Climbing this thing? Tony shouted back, gaining a few feet before ripping the leg out with a loud grinding noise, spare parts flying through the air before he slammed it back into its back, causing it to screech even louder as the leg sunk in deeper, leaving enough room for him to climb onto a flat area of its back. Jarvis! Start the power absorption. Tony shouted, small electrodes snapping off from his feet and attaching to the behemoth, electricity trailing up its length before it started into his suit. Power at 69% and climbing, sir. Leave it on the screen. Tony shouted, pulling up on the leg and jamming it in even further into the same hole, causing the monster to create an even louder screech, its legs giving out as it collapsed onto the ground, legs spread out, twitching, and stump flailing madly as Tony gritted his teeth and forced the appendage deeper into its back. Sir, scans suggest that you have punctured the creature's central furnace system. Energy absorption is a negative, sir. How much is already drained? Tony grunted, now trying to hold the leg steady as the beast twisted and trembled on the ground. My sources indicate near 67% of power has been drained. Remaining energy is depleting rapidly. Sensors indicate molten metal rising, sir. Tony barely managed to start his thrusters before melting slag poured out of the gashes on its side. With a quick yank upward, the leg was pulled free, glowing orange with heat before he slammed it through the monster's head, its jaw dropping and more of the molten slag pouring out from the furnace in its head. The air filled with a horrible wet dripping noise and the smell of burning plastic and smoke. Tony flipped off the monster, looking at his handiwork before looking at his team, drones on the ground all around. He looked at each of them, stony-faced or simply ignoring him altogether. Bruce had shifted back, wearing his emergency stash of clothing that he always seemed to resupply, and Thor was frowning, gently prodding a drone with his boot. I got it, Tony briefly stated, trying to break the ice as he flicked his visor open, preferring to hear their voices not through a comm link. Man of Iron, was the stabbing of the beast necessary? Thor grumbled, and now Tony realized why they weren't looking at him. The corpse of the metal contraption was still behind him. Hey, we didn't want it on Rampage, right? He defended, crossing his arms and scowling slightly as Natasha frowned. You could have just cut its throat, Stark. Not stab it 8 times and say it dry. She growled, and Tony's eyes widened shortly. Cut its throat? That would be much more risky. Well, sorry if this was worse. It got the job done, didn't it? Tony seethed and Steve looked up, eyes flashing. You may have gotten the job done, but you didn't have to maul it. It's a machine. It dashed. Tony's voice trailed off as he recognized the look on their faces, a mixture between fear and disappointment. You think I'd do that to a living thing? That was a robot. A machine. He weakly defended, waving his arm towards the slag-leaking machine behind him. Is that what Jarvis is? A machine you can stab 10 times because slicing its throat is too risky? Natasha spat, crossing her arms before collecting her knife from a nearby drone and stalking off to where she and Clint had parked their ride. Bruce sighed, following Steve, whom he was showing the town, and Thor took to the skies himself, leaving Tony all alone with the approaching shield to clean up the mess. I'm sorry, guys. He weakly stated, knowing very well that they couldn't hear. But in fact, he didn't feel guilt. Stark. Tony flipped one eye open, peering up at Natasha, who had a file folder in one hand, a scowl set on her face. Fury wants the report in by 6, get to work. She scowled, slapping the folder onto the edge of the sofa where he was currently sprawled out, taking a break from scanning through the articles on attempts to recreate an artificial intelligence system. You can tell Fury to write his own report? Tony muttered. Natasha ignored him, continuing out of the room, leaving him with the manila folder. With a sigh, he reached for the folder, hoping that something inside could help distract him from the headache-induced searching over the machine. Of course, it had to be about the machine. He sighed, flipping through a few photos of the machine taken from security cameras on surrounding buildings. Taking note of the computer-scanned images as what the SHIELD scientists assumed the creature looked like on the inside. The creature's core solidified only hours after being brought in, making further experiments impossible. He read a slight smirk. Should have kept the slag molten. He murmured under his breath, looking at the photos of the damaged hull, and the image replicated of a brand stamped on the inside furnace of the thing, the top half of it wrecked beyond fixing. The brand consisted of what looked like 6 legs and the bottom of something extending further out. The rest was destroyed. Jarvis, can you replicate this photo and project it? Tony asked, setting it on the table where a light scanned it before a duplicate set in blue hovered a few inches from the surface. Thanks, get rid of the borders and enlarge it. Tony responded, sifting through the evidence before coming to the blank form, which was half filled out. Do you wish for me to edit and repair all photo disruptions? Sure, then zoom in on the broken logo. Scan the military weapon providers for similar logos. Of course, sir. Shall I relate this search with the information regarding artificial intelligence? Keep the 2 separate, tell me if anything matches up between the 2. Tony mumbled through the pen cap in his mouth, looking at the sheet and adding his opinion on the threat level of the monster. They worked in silence, Tony glancing up occasionally to look over the city, or to take a break and get a few drinks. He always worked better when he couldn't think as strong. I think this is the first time I've ever seen you fill one of these out. Tony looked up, spotting Bruce standing in the doorway awkwardly, hands crammed in his pocket. Thought you ran off to South America? Tony responded, clicking off one of the bubbles asking if the monster used metal or was composed of it. Who made these questions? Nah, I think the other guy got me on the no-flying list. Bruce shrugged, walking further into the room. Tony gave a slight hum of agreement before looking up lazily. You know, I can fix that. Jarvis dashed. Dr. Banner's status has been removed from airport security systems. Thanks, you were saying? Tony asked, offering a glass of something that dulled his head to the other man. Bruce would deny anyways. Fury's been upset. That metal thing dash. That's Slagnert apparently. Tony added carelessly, noting Bruce's slack-jawed look with a chuckle. No joke, and it wasn't me, I swear. Tony grinned, holding his pen up in defense while he showed Bruce the typed word. The Slagner? That's worse than last week's Metal Muncher. Bruce exclaimed almost in horror, Tony giving a hum of agreement before clicking off another bubble that asked if the thing had created any property damage. I tell you, S.H.I.E.L.D. is just running out of names. I made a deal with them they couldn't steal names from bands. Tony stated calmly, noticing Bruce's blank look. They wanted to name that Metal Muncher the Iron Maiden. Nope, not going to stand for that. Tony grunted, clicking his pen shut and setting the documents down, finally finished. Anyways, Clint was thinking about going out for pizza, Thor has something to do in New Mexico, Natasha is with S.H.I.E.L.D., and Steve was going to meet us there. You up for it? Bruce asked, a slightly hopeful look in his eyes. A crooked grin as Tony's response, and Bruce mirrored a smile back. I'll be right there, I just need to grab my phone. Tony smirked, Bruce giving a small wave before turning for the elevator. Tony shuffled around until he saw the doors close, stopping what he was doing and pulling his phone from his pocket and clicking it on. Jarvis, reroute all information on that logo and AI into this phone. Get me all of Fury's personal notes on it, and Bruce's. Tony spoke quickly, spotting the screen begin to download the data. Sir, do you believe it is wise to do such thing? What, lie behind their backs? Trust me, Jarvis dashed, Tony started, hand in the elevator as he looked back at the room. I have a bad feeling about this. If anybody tries to find out what we're doing, put up firewalls. Of course, sir. Shall Mrs. Potts be aware of your speculations? No. Tony stated after some hesitation, and although Jarvis did not say anything, Tony knew he was surprised. I don't want her to get hurt. The less that know, the better. Tony stated firmly, stepping into the elevator and letting Jarvis automatically start to send him down to the garage. But Sir Dash. No, Jarvis. Only we know. Tony stated firmly, the rest of the ride branching into silence before walking out when the doors opened, grinning through his sunglasses that he snatched from a table he set there for the reason to put his glasses there. Clint and Bruce were already waiting. Clint leaned back and at ease sitting on the hood of the car they were taking, the only one with more than 2 seats. Huh, I didn't know this car had more than 2 seats. Bruce shrugged as Tony walked in, looking at one he was admiring and Clint was lounging on. It doesn't, it's a custom-made one. Tony smirked, walking in and tossing the keys in his hand as the two looked up, Clint smirking. So a Jag? Took you more for a Porsche type? Clint grinned and Tony smirked right back. Nah, more an Audi guy, get in? Tony snapped, forcing Clint to the somewhat cramped back seat, Bruce sitting on his right as he let the engine purr, looking in the mirror at the grouchy assassin. Bert boy, if you throw up, you're paying for the Elta. Tony smirked before flooring and shooting out of the garage with so much as a lurch. Slow down, Stark. You're going to kill us. Clint screeched, hanging onto the armrests with such fear, the Elta almost split under his pressing fingers. Please, Tweety, I've been driving these cars for more than a decade, have some faith? Tony scoffed, overtaking some slow minivan that was moving at a painfully slow pace. Don't the cops ever get you? Clint shouted back, Bruce looking out the window to hide his smile. The cops long ago tried. Now they just ignore me, it's not like they can catch me. Tony laughed, putting on more speed and causing Clint to see stars as Tony near collided with an oncoming truck before skillfully swerving to cause Clint's window to come within inches of the other truck's mirror. For the second half of the rather quick car ride, Clint was completely silent, eyes squeezed tight, and occasionally cursing when Tony veered suddenly to avoid another car. Bruce, however, was enjoying himself, actually having his window rolled down and letting the fast airbrush through his hair in a carefree action. They pulled into said pizzeria that they would be eating at, sliding perfectly in next to a motorcycle Tony immediately recognized as Steve. After all, he was the one that picked it out. The next few minutes were a blur of camera flashes, bribed waiters, greasy cheese that would make a teenager break out, and enough pop to fill a water trough. Lounging around on the bench seats, Tony looked up from his phone, still aware enough to scan through all the information Jarvis had transported onto his mobile device. So, pizza change from your time? Clint casually asked Steve, who was taking a sip from his drink, who looked over smiling. Completely different. There wasn't this much cheese before. Steve clarified, pulling a spare slice to show how the cheese stretched like a RBB band, glistening in the light. You're lucky you're not affected by it. This will clog up your arteries. Tony grinned, looking up and taking an exaggerated chomp out of the piece he had left. Bruce smiled slightly, before the group started blinking as bright camera flashes started to blind them, Steve throwing up his arms to shield his eyes from the sudden flashes. Oh no! Tony groaned, glaring at the flashes as they subsided slightly, revealing a red-haired reporter, pen and microphone already clipped at her waist, although she seemed more preoccupied with photos than anything. Hey you, I thought we said to tell us when the press came. Tony waved their waiter down, who was blushing in her embarrassment. I'm so sorry, Mr. Stark, they snuck through the back, Leave her, Tony. She didn't know. Bruce waved her off, keeping his eyes peeled at the slightly annoyed Tony who continued to glare at the reporter, who continued to flash the camera, now disrupting other eating customers. Miss, I must ask you to leave. You're disrupting my customers. A woman frowned, walking out from the back room, whipping her hands on a part of her apron, a frown on her aged face, now focused on the reporter. Oh, I'm sorry. The reporter responded, speaking sickly sweet as she puckered her bright lipstick-stained lips in a fake pout. Oh, then you won't mind leaving. The woman responded, crossing her arms as their waiter from before mouthed towards them, the owner. Leaving? Oh, I don't think that is necessary. The reporter sweetly responded, sending off another flash, just for fun, before the sick smile slid from her face and her voice lowered an octave as she glared at the owner. So, unless you want me to end your little life and grind it into such tiny pieces, then even an ant would walk all over it. She growled, spontaneously smiling, the sweet tone adopted once more. Now shoo. She giggled, waving her hands in a shooing-type manner, causing the owner to grit her teeth in annoyance. If you think that you can make me leave from my own restaurant, please. I make more money in paycheck than you do in a year. Now get out of my sight. Your smell is giving me a headache. The reporter sneered, flipping her hair over her shoulder while she looked back at the Avengers, about to take another $100 photo. If I were you, I'd wait, Stephanie Humbarks. Tony flippantly called, clicking away on his phone while she looked at him in alarm, the other people looking surprised at the sudden call. Tony, what are you? Clint asked, wary as Tony waved him off, glancing up at the reporter. Now, if you're smart, you'll leave this fine establishment. Tony icily responded, causing the woman to glare, lips curling, and she placed one manicured hand on her hip, huffing loudly. Never thought I'd be having an argument with Tony Stark. She shot back, hoping Tony would budge. Not a chance. This isn't an argument, this is a threat. If you don't leave right now, I can destroy your credit scores, zero your bank account, cancel that third wedding you're planning, and count you as a sex offender in 24 states. His lips curled in an amused smirk as he met her eyes. The fun part is finding out which states. She looked at him, eyes alit with horror and fear, although she huffed, trying to keep her tough act in play while ignoring the obvious wavering of her voice. You wouldn't do that, You saying I bluff? You published an article before about how the world would improve with my death, my fault for the racing incident in Monaco, accusing my clean energy program of pollution and chemical mutations, and you have the nerve to walk in with a pretty face and try to buy your way into fame? He snorted, folding up the pizza box while she glared, lip curling and arms trembling. Now, scram, before I grow bored of your cheap perfume and second-hand heels, and press this little button on my phone. He twisted the screen, showing a little screen questioning his actions. Steve watching in fascination as the woman bolted, leaving the owner watching in shocked awe as Tony apologized smoothly over the accident and slipped her a few $100 bills before letting the blushing waiter rush over and package up the remaining pizza, wishing them a better day. Tony relaxed, at ease while pretending to close his eyes, although peeking through his eyelashes to see the monochrome image of Clint look at Steve in alarm. Was it something he had done? Bruce, too, was eyeing him warily, as if he was a rabid dog that would lash out at any moment. When did they give him such uneasy glances? When did they, dare he say it, fear him? Tony flashed his eyes open the moment the waiter set the cardboard boxes on the table with a muffled thud, smiling awkwardly once more before vanishing, tending to her other tables. "Well, shall we go?" Tony asked, rising and looking at the others, Steve wincing when his legs stuck to the vinyl of the seat before he pulled it off. They walked towards the door, Steve hesitating before pulling out his keys and tossing them unexpectedly towards Tony, who caught them on reflex, blinking in surprise with a slight frown. "Thought you might want to ride my bike, you never get to?" Steve shrugged, Tony giving a slight smile and a nod before tossing his keys over, giving a wave before pulling out his phone once out of sight. "Jarvis, I want an audio link to everything that they're saying inside that car," he muttered, pressing the speaker to his ear. "Of course, sir. Don't you believe this is paranoia?" "I'm not sure anymore. Make the link through my Bluetooth?" Tony stated, clicking the phone shut and sliding said device into his ear before setting the helmet over his head, flicking down the visor and briefly praising his look from the restaurant's window reflection. Well, didn't he look good? He revved the engine, smiling with approval with the corresponding purr and the static crackling of voices that quickly came into focus. "Hey, let's wait until Stark leaves." It was obviously Clint from the tone of voice. Tony gave a one-armed salute before burning RBB, jumping the curb and landing on the high traffic, easily weaving with less care as he eavesdropped, blasting through a yellow light. "Okay, he's gone. No joke there. If he wrecks my bike, he's buying a new one. Please, Steve, I'm sure Tony would love to buy you a new bike, this one with a little bell and whistles." Tony chuckled, already the sight of his tower looming higher and higher as he approached. He noticed one cop car who didn't even attempt to chase him. 20 miles over the speed limit wasn't within the cop's care zone. He turned, tires squealing as he rid up the ramp to his garage, over the visitors' cars, pulling into the white and glass room, all the while maintaining a link on a conversation filled mostly with laughter and comments about nearby pedestrians. Apparently they were stuck behind a truck at a red light that was labeled "Bananamy Crazy," or something along those lines. So for start, anyone else feel a little freaked out about that reporter chick? Tony froze, halfway to the elevator before turning looking at where his car would be turning in eventually. You're right, Clint, he scared me a little too." "Scared? Captain America being scared? It wasn't in the face of danger or against Loki. What was messing with him?" "I don't know, guys." "Oh, so you think Fury's lying and Stark won't go all insane and try to kill us in our sleep?" Clint shot back, causing Tony's breath to hitch. "Tony wouldn't do that. Please, Bruce, what do you think? You're the scientific person, you can tell us about mental health and all that, right? Is he going to be like another Loki?" I don't know." It was Bruce's small soft reply that caused Tony to choke, turning and punching the nearest panel of glass. He watched it fall while his hand, strangely, wasn't harmed. He walked away, taking out the Bluetooth and crunching it beneath his feet, as if the act of it being destroyed would destroy the possibility of what they said being true. He walked towards his emergency storage area filled with gin, and took a swig from the bottle itself, not bothering to grab a crystal cup from the side, then hesitated, setting the bottle back on the rack. He'd need his brain intact to be able to plan his next move. They thought he was a threat. They thought he was insane. Fine, let them think that. "Jarvis, what houses do I have?" Tony spoke, already walking towards his desk, grabbing a portable file folder to store projects he was currently working on, practically snatching the mystery of that signature marking and the AI production. "Sir, you have one house residing in Monaco, Cuba, Papua New Guinea, Australia, Sweden, India, France, Italy, 2 in Canada on each coast, Russia, and Brazil, several throughout the United States." Tony hummed, waving Jarvis to continue. "Yeah, narrow the search to Canada. Where exactly?" Tony asked, moving more plans onto the file drive. "House number 1, located on Vancouver Island near Vancouver in the British Territories, Canada. It overlooks the ocean and is built with 12 guest rooms, 10 baths as well as a fully stocked kitchen, garage. However, it does not have a completed lab." "And the other?" he asked, looking up shortly. "The other is located on the Bay of Fundy, the western shore of Nova Scotia, Canada. It is an ocean view with 6 rooms with 5 baths. There is no garage, however, there is a boat launch nearby." There is a fully stocked kitchen and lab. Tony hummed his throat, pausing as he thought. The homes in the U.S.? There are currently 9. List them. A large estate located on the outskirts of Las Vegas, Nevada. A small estate hidden in the Rocky Mountains in Northern California. A small estate located in Malibu, California. A medium estate located in Seattle, Washington. A large estate located in Madison, Wisconsin. A small estate in Mackinac Island, Michigan. A medium home located in Orlando, Florida. A large manor hidden in eastern Maine. And the current Stark Towers located in New York. And the least likelihood of the others finding me in any of these houses? The least chance of discovery would be in Madison, Wisconsin. And the chances? 67%, sir. Tony cursed, banging his fist against the tabletop as he thought, swiping his hand through a nearby hologram. How about North America? Does that help my chances? Shall I include Cuba, sir? Leave it out. The DMN security is strong to get in and out of. Tony mentioned, Jarvis calculating the chances. The least likelihood of being discovered would be at your small home in Nova Scotia, Canada, with a percentage chance of 42%. Better than nothing. Jarvis, organize my flight. Delete all records of this discussion and of my arrival here at the tower. Pepper is in Japan talking to some business people or something, and besides her, Rhodey is the only other one who knows where I am. Make sure Platypus is out of the way. I don't want him dragged into this. Of course not, sir. Shall I call a car to drive you to your personal jet? Just get me happy. Tell him I need a break or I'm going to snap under the stress. Make sure Fury can't trace the call. Will that be all, sir? Let Pepper or Rhodey contact me if only they say it's an emergency. Reroute all calls from the Avengers or Fury back here. Make them think I've dropped off the map. The way you are advancing, sir, I am starting to assume you will fake your own death. Then you'd be out of a job. Tony smirked, looking at the AI system he had so fondly created. Sir, shall I alert you if New York is under serious threat of another hostile invasion of any kind? Only if the others can't handle it. Tony nodded, already walking out and up the elevator to where he knew he'd be able to relax in the peace and quiet until Happy got there. How shall I alert the others of your absence, sir? Let them know. Tony shrugged, eyes flashing open as the doors opened and showed the wide-open terrace overlooking the other buildings that were surprisingly appealing so far below. Just show them the audio feed you got. I know you recorded it, Jarvis. Only let them hear once I'm gone and my trail is clean. Give Happy a holiday after I'm gone. Send him to Denver. He likes to ski, right? Colorado has good skiing spots, right? Yes, sir. Shall the expenses be paid for by Stark Industries? Of course. Speaking of Happy, where is he? Mr. Hogan is currently 3 miles away. And the others? Are 8.9 miles away. It seems that Mr. Barton has stopped to retrieve movies from a nearby rental store. Perfect. Tony nodded, pausing and looking out once more with a frown. By the way, lock my liquor cabinets. Of course, sir. Tony relaxed, lounging in a comfortable brown chair that overlooked the cliff face and water so far below, similar to his Malibu home. There was an odd peacefulness that seemed to fill the tiny house, a thick fog that cleared and yet dulled his usually AD thoughts. So, instead of holograms surrounding his every sight with loud AC/DC or Black Sabbath blaring loud enough to make his head throb, here he had only one screen, roughly the size of a laptop on a glass side table, not a single whisper of music, although Jarvis amplified the sound of the waves on rocks and the loud gulls from outside. Looks like Bruce didn't use a bag of weed. Jarvis, can you cross-reference this sign with any others we've seen on other mech we've fought? Tony sighed, glaring at the bottom half of a logo that continued to mock him. He wanted to find that sign just so he could destroy it. Scanning, scanning, scanning complete. 2 matches found. Tony started upward, looking at the screen and pulling it up, looking at the results. What are they, Jarvis? Tony asked, eyes alight as suddenly all of the results appeared upon the glass windows, blocking the view as he jumped to his feet, moving aside a few useless articles. Pull up the images with the logo, do a complete scan and show me the copy rate. And project? Tony nodded, a few blips and a completed logo stood in front of him. It was an odd logo, reminding Tony slightly of the SHIELD logo. It was a scorpion facing forward, the bottom half of the creature being what Tony was familiar with. The words below were straight across and almost in a military font stating boldly SRP. Scorp? Is that it? It doesn't read scorpion or anything. It's just Scorp? Tony asked, frowning as he looked at the intricate metal design. Correct, sir. This logo only has the initials creating the word SRP. Okay, where are they found? Tony sighed, flicking away a few articles related to scorpions, not the logo. The logo was found on the inside shell of numerous metal components found on the drones of Ivan Vanko, and on the inside design of Obadiah Stane's metal suit. What? Tony gasped, bolting upright as Jarvis replayed the security feed of people panicking while the hammer drones flew around, shooting things in sight. The frame froze, zooming in on the tiny quarter-size logo imprinted on a weapon shoved into the drone's arm, showing the scorpion sign. Okay, Hammer employed these people. Jarvis. Which prison has Hammer in it? Tony asked, exhaling shakily as Jarvis searched. Justin Hammer is located in the National Prison. Interesting name. Does S.H.I.E.L.D. have any links there? Tony asked after muttering under his breath. S.H.I.E.L.D. has tracers and scanners over 3 of the prison's inhabitants. Justin Hammer is not under S.H.I.E.L.D. watch, sir. Perfect. Do you think I can organize a meeting with him? The security of the prison is extremely secure, sir. These prisoners are never to be released to the public in fear of attempting uprising. So? Tony prodded, frowning slightly at the description. I will look into that, sir. Where would you like to meet with Mr. Hammer? Any nearby empty plane hangars? Tony asked with a hum, pulling up the information himself. Sir, you are suggesting a transportation of Mr. Hammer to the location of your choosing? Well, can't let the others catch a whiff of me in some prison. They may get the wrong idea with them thinking I'm going evil. Tony sniffed, looking away with a growing scowl on his face. Perhaps an exchange should be made? Mr. Hammer is brought outside the compound under military watch? No, that would still make it look suspicious, but the military can get in. Tony lurched to his feet, moving in walk before it turned into pacing while he rambled on and on about what he thought, letting Jarvis listen patiently. Rhodey. He can get in, say it's some military business and needs to know more about the Hammer drones, then he can link me through to Hammer. But how would he do that? The phone isn't really a good idea. S.H.I.E.L.D. could trace its Skype. No, it would be odd to carry in a laptop. Perhaps you should communicate through the tablet you issued Colonel Rhodes some time ago. Genius. Tony beamed, dropping back down into his chair as he smirking, as if he won the lottery. Jarvis, feed me through to Platypus? Tony grinned, waiting as he heard the dial tone throughout the room he was sitting in. Hello. After a click and a fumbling noise, Rhodey's voice filled the room. Platypus. Tony cried out, and Rhodey on the other line chuckled tiredly. Tony. Let me guess, you got in trouble with the military again? Ah no. Tony scowled, Rhodey laughing playfully with his response. Nice to hear. What do you need? I have a feeling this isn't a social call. Saw you on the TV with those Avenger people. Just to let you know, we did not send that nuke and dash. Yeah, don't worry about it. Anyways, I'm doing some solo inventing for a while. Tony, by going solo you made a robot that has a fascination with fire extinguishers? Hey, in my defense he ruined my clothes too. You still owe me a new suit. Yeah, anyways, I need you to do me a favor. Spit it out, Tony. I need you to meet with Hammer and link me through on a tablet so I can question him a few things. Tony blurted, the other side of the line going quiet a few moments, probably Rhodey moving to a more secluded area. Tony, are you crazy? Rhodey hissed under his breath, and Tony sighed into his hand, listening to Rhodey's rant. You can't just expect me to walk into a high-security prison. Those people would kill me. No, they would find me, break everyone in my body, then eat me. Eat you? Tony asked dryly. Rhodey made a scoffing noise and Tony could imagine him throwing his arms into the air. Hell if I know what prison people eat. Look, Rhodey dash. No. You listen to me. I'm not going to go through with this again. I might get kicked off, because you wanted me to run one of your little favors. I dash. No. Give me one good reason why I should help you. And don't pull that friend card, Tony. You know my job is important to me. Tony sat on the couch, rubbing his temples while he decided whether to tell he could endanger his friend if he did. Look, Tony, I've got to go dash. Hammer may have whereabouts of a weapon manufacturer that's been helping him with his drones and OB's suit. He's building monsters and setting them loose in the city, and I need to find the manufacturer. Tony blurted at once, a small feeling of hope rising as he realized the phone hadn't been disconnected. What? That bad? Tony sympathized for the shocked tone Rhodey used, wincing at the crackling silence on the other side. Fine. What's the cover story, Stark? The truth. You need information regarding Justin's hammer drones for military purposes? Tony smoothly responded, hearing Rhodey scoff at the other end. Military purposes? Yeah, that'll happen the day you make a cake for that Captain America fellow. Yeah, you know me too well. Tony chuckled, practically hearing Rhodey's smile on the other side. So, take what with me? Just the tablet if you can. I'll be able to make communication from that and knock out the cameras if Jarvis has a strong enough feed. As soon as you enter, just stall him a few moments before we've got them down. Got it. When do you need to talk with him? Sooner the better. Tony shrugged, leaning back on his seat. I'm free tomorrow at 1. I'll call you before I get inside. Got it? Tony nodded, and Rhodey paused a moment on the line, obviously suffering pride to ask him, You're not making one of those life-changing decisions again, right? Well, Platypus, you'll be glad to know that I've got you in my will just in case. Tony snickered. He could practically hear Rhodey's eye roll before he hung up. Jarvis, feed a link to the tablet Rhodey has. Tony stated once he too hung up from the call. Already done, sir. Well, aren't you independent today? Tony smirked, looking up at a monitor as he prepared a drink at the bar. I try my best, sir. Of course you do. Tony smiled, looking out over the water just as a whale breached in the distance. He could get used to this. Tony? I'm going in. Tony gave a grim smile from the computer he sat at, looking and monitoring the link he had with the tablet as Rhodey walked past security, making his way to said cell that held a certain wanted criminal. Got that, Platypus. We're in the security. Tony responded over the feed, glancing at the many screens he held in the workshop as he flitted through the security cameras and positioning of each jail cell door. Security is on loop, you're free. Tony added once he noticed Rhodey moving through the holographic halls Jarvis had constructed on a miniature model. Got it, thanks Tony. Don't thank me yet, Tony warned, feeling the urge to knock on wood strongly as said words echoed in the room. Tony watched, monitoring and editing the computer records that had Rhodey's visit recorded as well as changing the schedule, leaving the guards on the other side of the building as Rhodey filled him through, just to be safe. After a few seconds of tapping away and messing with the guards, a small beep indicated that the feed was available to open with. Tony spun in his chair, leaning back as he looked at the screen, which showed what the tablet Rhodey was issued with displayed. Hammer. Tony greeted with a smirk. Justin Hammer, or what he once was, scowled at him from the other side. Hammer still had his glasses, obviously bent, probably from some tussle. His clothing that used to be suits that tried to impersonate Tony's own was now replaced with a wrinkled orange jumpsuit with a 5-digit code that was his prison number. Stark. I would ask why you're here, but you sent in some hired help instead. Come to gloat? You wish. Tony nodded off flippantly, smirking at Hammer's more and more hateful glare. I'm here for information. Where did Vanko get the things to build those drones? Tony asked, tone swapping from not caring to interrogating mode. Hammer grinned on the other side, crossing his arms, shackled, Tony noticed, and saying nothing. I see. You're throwing me the silent treatment? Tony mused, and Hammer's eyes narrowed if anything. Well, I tried. Platypus, leave us? Tony ordered, and noticing the screen shift as he was set on the opposite bench from Hammer, briefly noticing Rhodey in the reflection of the wall leaving through the door. It was silent a few moments as Tony and Hammer glanced and glared at each other. Why are you here, Stark? Normally you'd make a real appearance before making one of your lackeys haul in a computer. Tony's eyes narrowed at Hammer's tone of voice. He was slightly annoyed by the way he treated Rhodey, but he had to make sure Rhodey wouldn't be targeted if he said anything wrong. Can't get the wrong image going through the press, they won't get off my back anymore. Tony quipped, noticing Hammer's scowl. Yes, I heard. You with a misfit group of heroes. Why couldn't you just be a normal rich guy and buy a baseball team? I'm Tony Stark. Tony spoke slowly as if Hammer couldn't understand. He almost smiled at the growl Hammer gave, almost. So, Venko, where did he get the materials to build the drones? Tony asked, leaning back and playing with the circuits, moving away one guard who moved too close to the hallway. I don't have to answer to you, Stark. Really? You want to play this game? Tony sighed, looking at Hammer with one unimpressed lifted eyebrow, before sitting back, all playful attitude vanishing as if someone had just erased emotion on his face. Hammer Industries' stock practically died when you got arrested, however you stuck the remaining power of the business to one of your employees who is actually moving the funding money to try and bail you out of that cell. One flick of my button, and I could lose a year's worth of cargo in an unfortunate warehouse fire. Tony calmly answered, giving a slight hum at the end, before looking at Hammer. His eyes were wide at being caught, before he bared his teeth in anger. You try to threaten me? I've been keeping that money safe since my arrest. One warehouse of cargo doesn't mean anything to me. Your bank account that holds the money's PIN number is 7821, your teller is Kathy Jarkson, lives on 721 Sycamore Street and can be given a very nice vacation funded by Stark Industries while her files are broken into, sadly Justin Hammer's bank account scattered and all information deleted. Bet that would put your bailout a few years back. Tony added, face voice of emotions as he noticed Hammer's horror. You wouldn't have the guts to do that. Hammer, I'm on a superhero team and kill aliens and metal monsters on a daily basis. Breaking into a bank for me is as strong as giving a hobo a $20 bill. Tony stated dryly, causing Hammer to swallow in fear. If Tony noticed, he didn't mention it, or he didn't care. Venko got the metal from some metal smelter in Colorado. And the weapons? The plans? Tony pressed, causing Hammer to give him a dirty look before responding. The weapons are from smuggled shipments of your own. Stark Industries made rather good bombs. My men took them apart and made them Hammer Industries. Where were the Stark weapon shipments? Tony cut in, causing Hammer to give him a victorious grin as he shrugged, causing Tony to curl his hands into tight fists. The plans were what our hackers were able to get from the rubble from your first arc reactor. Obadiah's plans? Tony grumbled under his breath before giving a slight curse. He thought he got all of those? Fine. Do you know about anything, an agency called SRP? At once Hammer lurched, sitting upright in alarm at the name. SCRP? What do you know about them? What do you mean? Tony's eyes narrowed as he noticed Hammer's growing anxiety of the subject. I know things, but that doesn't matter. What is SRP? 10,000 gone. 20,000 gone. Tony growled, causing Hammer to strain at his chains. All right. They shouldn't be able to tell if I tell you. They're everything, Stark. They are genius, I tell you. They have hands in everything, medical research, weapons manufacturing, and chemical and gamma radiation. If they find you, you had better hide, Stark. Or they'll ruin you. They found you, didn't they? Tony hummed, and Justin Hammer swallowed, eyes scanning the walls. Don't go looking for them, Stark. I hate you, but don't go pissing them off. You may think you and your group of misfit toys may be able to take them on, but they aren't just something you can hit with a stick, Stark. Too intricate with society? Tony mused, leaning back in his chair as he watched Justin give a slight nod. They've got weapons like yours. The energy blasts dash. Repulsors? Tony corrected, but Hammer probably hadn't heard. Are just like yours. They aren't the color though, they're red and dash. Hammer, stop. You're rambling. Tony frowned, then jumped in surprise as something on his left keeping control of the security feeds started to fizzle, cameras moving without his command or shutting off entirely. What, Jarvis, what is going on? Tony blinked, forgetting all about Hammer on the screen. Protocol 57 Delta is in order, sir. I detect a hacker from the opposite feed line attempting to gain control of all security measures. The other side? Why would they need to hack in the prison? Tony frowned, and Hammer visibly flinched in the cell. It's SRP. They're here. They're dash. Shut up. Jarvis, open a link of the surrounding area and heat signatures. Of course, sir. There are 2 helicopters and 1 car arriving at the prison base. Thanks. Bring a feet up. Tony frowned as he saw the car pull up, opening the black doors and tinted windows as a man stepped out, other following behind the blonde-haired man as he walked towards the doors. The guards walked forward, holding up a gun threateningly and calling warning. His arm trembled as the lead man took some sort of weapon out of the hands of the man on his left, aiming the large turret-looking weapon at the man and door, firing off something with a high-pitch whistle. "Sheet. Jarvis, analyze that," Tony ordered as he got to his feet, witnessing something with high power and brightly red in color slam into the doors and knock them loose, burns on the outer side. "My scans indicate condensed energy used in a blast form. You telling me they have repulsors?" Tony blinked, frowning as he heard Hammer cursing under his breath. With a huff, he pressed a button that replicated mute and continued to look at the scans. "Correct. The repulsors used are only 15% the power of the suits, and are in a much bulkier form. What about the guards? What are they doing once they find them? Heat signatures are failing rapidly. I am one to suspect that these agents are killing all guards." "Rhodey," Tony shouted, jumping to his feet while Jarvis automatically pulled up a phone number, dialing rapidly. "Tony? What's wrong?" "Rhodey, you've got to get out of there." Tony practically yelled into the device, causing Rhodey a few seconds to recover. "What? Tony, what are you talking about?" "Listen to me, Rhodey. You need to get out of that building. Forget about the tablet, I can detonate it. Get outside and get as far away as you can." "Fine, I'm not going to his dash." A loud boom was heard and the line went dead on the other side. Glancing at the tablet, he unmated it and heard footsteps and voices drawing closer. "Jarvis, detonate the tablet." "On it, sir." "Shall I ready the Mark 6 for flight?" "Get it?" Tony growled, lurching to his feet, shedding his coat onto the ground as he walked, kicking off the not-needed shoes and peeling off his undershirt, leaving him in a tank top as he bolted into the small lab, jumping onto the installed platform. He shifted as the panels slid onto his body, pressing firmly onto his legs and thighs as it wrapped its way up his torso, shifting the small metal slots that resembled scales and protected his arms as he tensed his fingers, getting used to the feeling. "Shall I make a guidance map to the location of the prison?" "Where is it?" Tony growled, eyes flicking around as he launched himself into the air, already blasting through the air at a fast speed. 300 miles due east, located in Berlin, Vermont. "Patch me through to the Air Force. Tell them that I'm flying through." Tony growled, pressing more power into his thrusters, causing him to blast through the skies as a quick pace, already nearly over the Bay of Fundy as he spotted Maine in front of him, growing quickly. "They understand, sir." "Good, call up Pepper." "Sir? Do it." Tony growled, noticing a picture of Pepper on the left side of his vision as the little phone button used its animation. "Hello? Miss Potts speaking." "Pepper." Tony shouted relief in his voice. "Tony? What? Why are you calling me?" "Pepper, where are you?" Tony asked, swerving to avoid a bird. "I'm at the airport. I had a conference in Peru over clean energy." "Good Peps, I need you to do a big favor for me," Tony stated, completely serious as he continued on, now over the USA borderline. He heard Pepper sigh and took that as a sign to continue. "I need you to change your flight to Nova Scotia," Tony added, a second of silence before Pepper broke it. "Nova Scotia? You want me to fly to Canada? Do you remember that house I made years ago? On the coast of Nova Scotia?" "Of course I do. I need you to stay there for a bit," Tony added, and he heard Pepper sigh once more. "Tony, I mean it. I'm going to send Rhodey there too soon." "What's wrong? Are we being targeted or something?" "Yes, actually. Once you get inside, Jarvis will start the security field around the house. You'll be safe there." "Will you be? Safe, I mean?" Tony gave a smile, laughing slightly as he moved again, more than halfway to his destination. "Sure, Peps. See ya in Canada." Tony smiled, hearing Pepper snort at his crude rhyming before the smile dropped as she hung up, his eyes intent on the target of his choice. He landed easily on the ground just outside of the prison, spotting the several cars in the secured parking lot, a few with energy burns racing up the side, destroying the details and paint. "Rhodey," Tony called out, Voice fixed by the robotic auto-tune as he started walking into the building, hands ready for blasting if anyone came close. He made his way into the building, automatically walking to the location where he thought Rhodey would be. He started through, not looking at the dead prisoners with energy burns all over them, or the way BLD occasionally spread far enough out into the hallway that the suit made a slightly wet slipping noise. "Rhodey!" Tony shouted again, walking and turning a corner right as something smashed into his face, causing him to vary back as Jarvis took a moment to fix the deactivated screen. Tony blinked, looking at a relieved-looking Rhodey with the broken remains of what looked to be a metal sink. "Tony! God, I thought it was one of those masked men." Rhodey explained, not at all looking ashamed that he had just hit Tony in the face strong enough with a porcelain and metal sink that the porcelain was cracked. "You hit me with a sink," Tony growled, and Rhodey gave a shrug. "Told you, you had a thick skull?" Rhodey defended, and Tony sighed, holding his hand out in which Rhodey handed over the phone Tony had sent him via Iron Man. "Anyways, these things may go after you again. I'm programming this phone with the quadrants to a safe house. Don't tell anyone about it, and I've scheduled you a vacation on the way over. Don't repeat this address, and delete it once you get there," Tony ordered, and Rhodey gave a frown but nodded, grabbing the phone before turning to a light job and vanishing out of sight, presumably towards his car. "Hammer," Tony sighed, moving and pressing on the cell door, wincing as it fell completely to the ground, caving in. Tony scanned the ground, swallowing thickly as he noticed Hammer in the corner, back burned to shreds by the other men's repulsors, and the tablet a charred mess of wires and broken glass. "Sir, I am receiving signals from others within the vicinity. How far away are they?" Tony asked, looking away from the corpse of his long-lost foe and once friend. "They are moving at such acceleration they will be within the vicinity in seconds." Tony turned, walking towards the entrance, and turning, he had not even taken 3 steps out of the front door before a bright spotlight from a helicopter thumping loudly overhead shone on him, causing his vision to turn white shortly. Tony blinked as he took notice of the ranks of S.H.I.E.L.D. operatives fitted out with guns that were pointed at him. "Hi guys. You can go, I've already checked out the scene." Tony shrugged, pointing behind him while he looked at the men, waiting for them to disperse. "Negative, Iron Man. You are to be taken in S.H.I.E.L.D. custody," the leader with the largest gun shouted, causing Tony to stumble back a step. "What? Custody? What did I owe you think I did that?" Tony exclaimed, voice rising slightly in shock as he briefly looked at the ruins of the prison behind him. "Correct. You can come willingly or we will capture you by force," the man shouted, and Tony took one good look at the many troops and the groups of trucks that had arrived in the few moments Tony had been standing there. "What? I didn't do this," Tony shouted, and the men gave no response except for pointing their guns. "Jarvis, odds for a full fight with repulsors on stun? The percentage possibility is at 21% of escaping by fighting means." Tony winced at the percentage and took against it. "Sorry guys, but I've got to jet." Tony nodded, taking a running step before his thrusters kicked in, sending him upwards. He briefly noticed 3 S.H.I.E.L.D. jets circle in, spreading out in a way that forced Tony to have to fly between them. "What are they doof?" Tony winced as he slammed into something. He twisted, tugging at his arm as it seemed to be stuck before he ripped it free. Something thick and black with exposed wires tore free. "Jarvis! Activate thrusters!" Tony shouted, turning to try to escape before the jet above Tony dove, apparently dropping something or doing something because suddenly the web Tony collided with seemed a lot tighter as the jet moved quickly, diving and causing him to be forced to the ground. The jet pulled up and Tony scrambled, kicking out while his foot seemed to be caught in the annoying invisible net. The jet paused before something sparked along the wire, exposing how big the thing was in reality. Tony instinctively arched his back and yelped loudly as electricity seeped through the armor, screen on the fritz just like when Vanko managed to zap him. "Jarvis! Thrusters! Jarvis? Jarvis!" Tony cried out as the net seemed to detach from the jets, and he collided painfully with the ground in a mess of wire and black rope. Tony still was rather confused as to how he had been stopped in mid-flight and his suit being taken down, but as he was shoved into a Quinjet, still attached to the net, unsurprisingly, he was watched by 3 guards. "We're ready for takeoff, sir." One of his guards spoke up, and through the tiny eye slits in Tony's mask, he was able to spot the captain's head, only the back of it. On it, the voice grumbled, added with tousled short brown hair, and a side Tony could recognize anywhere. "Clint?" Clint was taking him hostage and onto the helicarrier. Fury could have just asked, "Is he conscious?" Normally he'd be talking. Clint called back, and Tony felt a moment of red-hot anger. It's strong to talk when a teammate just backstabs you. Tony wanted to shoot back, but chose to remain silent. He briefly noticed a guard trying to pry off his mask, and the best he could, he went limp. They were more likely to spill information if they thought he was out cold. Finally, they managed to pry it somewhat back, glancing in and frowning when they spotted his unconscious face. "He's out, sir." Perhaps the electricity was too much for him? The guard asked, and Clint shook his head with a sigh. No, it was made to render his suit useless. The landing must have knocked him out. Clint sighed. "Oh, I'm going to knock you out, Tweety." Tony actually did pass out at some point. The idiots at S.H.I.E.L.D. didn't think his suit had shorted out, and sent another bout of electricity into it. Just for that, Tony was going to make all security cameras show a video of a Nyan cat for 3 days straight. When Tony awoke, it took a strong willpower to not jump off wherever he was and punch the closest person he could find in the face. If it were Clint, it would be an added bonus. He remained still, noticing briefly that he was in the clothes he suited up with, short-sleeve shirt and slacks. It was cozy in Canada, and was missing his shoes to some degree. He inhaled, trying to analyze what room he was in. It was filled with the smell of alcohol, not the drinking kind, and had a bright light shining right on his face that added to the whole reason why he woke up. He couldn't hear anyone, so he decided to screw the whole "I can be a spy too" thing and just groan and open his eyes. And he did just that, finding out that he was sitting in a rather uncomfortable chair, and his wrists were tied to said chair with the same black net as before. He frowned, tugging on it slightly before kicking out with his feet, noticing how they were not constricted in any way, and hissing in pain as his toes collided with the metal table in front of him, sending tiny jolts of throbbing pain. He hissed slightly, rubbing his toe against his other leg as his head snapped around at the sound of metal shifting, the door opening. Tony scowled as some S.H.I.E.L.D. worker walked in, holding some sort of tablet, not his creation, and dressed in an innocently blinding white. "Hello, Mr. Stark. My name is Mr. Killinger." The man nodded, setting the tablet on the table in such way Tony could not see the screen, nor reach it. Yeah, you're my interrogator. It is insulting how they do not send anyone better." "I don't like to be insulted, you hear, Nikki?" Tony shouted, craning his neck to stare at the walls, which were probably one-way glass. His interrogator sighed, typing something on the tablet before leaning back in his seat. "I apologize for the inconvenience of me interrogating you when you request Director Fury instead," the man bitterly stated, and Tony gave a large cheery grin in response. "Mr. Stark, please pay attention." The man sighed, and Tony rolled his eyes, convinced he should do everything except that. "Where's my shoe?" "I want my shoes, those were made in Venice." Tony pouted and the man sighed, rubbing his temples. "We find that most of our prisoners tend to not escape when without shoes. So I'm a prisoner now? Ouch, I feel that right in my heart, Nikki." His interrogator huffed and crossed his arms, glaring until Tony looked at him, finally giving him lazy attention. "What was your position for the last 52 hours? The man tallied off, keeping a level tone of voice. 52, huh? Wow, thought it was longer than that." Tony blinked, and leaned back in his chair, arms crossing to support his neck as he relaxed. "What was your posy dash?" "I heard you, Klein dash." "Killinger, Mr. Stark." The man bitterly corrected, Tony waving his hand off as if he didn't care. There was a brief moment of silence while the man seemed to collect himself before speaking slowly. "Where is the location of Mrs. Pepper Potts and Mr. James Rhodes?" Tony let a small twitch of his lips turn into a smile as he realized that S.H.I.E.L.D. had no information about his Nova Scotia home, nor the locations of his 2 closest friends. "How should I know? I'm tied to a table," Tony pointed out, the man frowning and clicking on the tablet while Tony watched barely. After finding over 17 faults in the tablet from sound, screen, and backing alone, the man spoke again. What was your motive on the murder of a Mr. Justin Hammer? Oh, I didn't kill him, Tony sent back, having opened his eyes from a momentarily sleepy-induced fit. Oh, for God's sake. Tony heard a faint muffle before the door slammed open, causing the Klieg Killinger person to jump. Natasha Lai. I wondered when you'd visit. Tony piped up, all cheery with a grin on his face while mentally he was noticing all faults of her and any escape routes possible. Natasha scowled, and Tony held a steady grin while inside he was quivering. The recent death of Hammer, he hated the man, but seeing him dead, his capture, and the obvious idea that he was the killer was throwing his mind out of whack. Messing with the said Natasha was something he could finally cross off his bucket list. Shut up, Stark, now. She grabbed the back of his neck, slamming his head onto the table with enough force to cause his head to throb as she flipped over, legs around his neck, nearly choking him while she leaned close to his ear, her weight pressing harder on his head into the table, giving a painful pinching feeling. I think we can have a conversation. Why did you kill Hammer? She growled, and as Tony winced from the weight, she pulled up, slamming his head into the table once more. He blinked as darkness stirred on his vision. His gut hurt from where the table ledge jammed in painfully every time, and if it wasn't for the sapphire glass covering the case of his reactor, he was sure it would have broken. One more slam, and he blearily noticed a small red puddle of BLD that was spreading the more his skull smeared it around. Had he hit a nail on the table? No, the supports were too far apart. A nail in this location would cause nothing but weakening on the joints. Sometimes, Tony really wanted his brain to shut up. He gagged once Natasha's legs decided to cut off air to his brain as an added bonus. A near 30 seconds, he'd been counting, when she released him, the lack of pressure caused him to gasp for air, ignoring how his gasps caused a small amount of the smeared BLD to make his tongue frown angrily. Against the sudden metallic taste. Didn't? Tony chalked out as his head was slammed back into the table, causing his entire body to shudder. The blasts used to kill Hammer and the other prisoners are recognized as repulsor blasts. SHIELD has been monitoring all information about attempted suits and reactors. If there was a repulse created, we'd know. Natasha coldly stated again, and Tony wanted to hit her for her ignorance. Yeah, and apparently if you knew just as much as you make me want to know, then this interrogation wouldn't even be needed. Bruce energy outputs? Tony gasped out and Natasha tilted her head slightly to the side, eyes narrowed. Dr. Banner is currently away resolving an issue out of city. If you tell us exactly what to look for, I am sure our SHIELD scientists will be able to distinguish your proof from lies. Natasha smoothly sent back, and Tony held back the urge to roll his eyes. Can't, Tony gasped, and grunted as his head collided once more. SHIELD idiots. Tony rushed out, the slamming hesitating as he groaned while cold air hit the smashed and highly likely bruised side of his face. Thank you for your time. I assure you we aren't done with you, Natasha assured, rising up and calmly stepping off of the table, her sharp-pointed heels leaving small BLD prints as she walked to the door and knocked twice, guards opening it and letting her through while Tony lied there, breathing shallowly as he waited to recover enough so passing out wasn't an option at this point. He blinked, lifting his head and scowling as he noticed the amount of BLD that had smeared. No doubt, the BLD had made its way all over his face. It probably would harden to a crusty shell and make talking difficult by tomorrow. He looked at the BLD puddle, barely enough to cover the surface, but surprisingly drawing a reflection, enough of one that he could see the rough outline of his face and the darker spots where he assumed the torn skin was. He glanced at his feet, wiggling his toes before sighing, wriggling and shifting in his seat to try to lift his foot up high enough it could rest on his lap. He wriggled, hissing in pain as his throbbing toes jammed into the chair. He sat in from a mis-aimed guess of distance, and finally he was able to snag his foot on one knee. Working with the ties that strapped his arms to the chair, he pulled his foot towards him, tugging his fingers before he removed a single white pristine sock, and his foot fell to the ground with a loud thud. Now came the part he hated. He eyes the sock with distaste, knowing that attempting to throw it onto the table would end in disaster, and his fingers were unavailable. However, once Pepper force-fed him tofu just to try it, he was sure there was nothing worse tasting. A few seconds later and a horrible sweaty and dirt taste in his mouth later. He almost preferred the BLD. The sock was set on the corner of the table, and he had his head leaned against it, pressing with enough pressure to stop the BLD flow before he grew too dizzy. Let it be said that Tony Stark could escape. He did so walking around in the desert wearing a giant toaster. He was sure as hell he could escape from a shield base. To make it more impressive, he would do it without his shoes. Just for Killinger. Tony knew that a fair amount of time had passed. He noticed this because the BLD puddle had hardened, changed color, cracked, and now had tiny dust particles that tasted horrible when he accidentally inhaled it. He had gotten the scrapes on his head to stop bleeding, and now his BLD sock sat on the table, a rather dark color now. The moment the door budged a little bit, Tony snapped his head up, looking with alarm at the door as opened, and he frowned, spotting a large figure and a vastly smaller one shuffle into the room, sitting in the chair across from Tony as he blinked, staring at the two. "Friend Tony," Thor greeted, looking uncomfortable to be in Tony's presence. Or maybe the chair was just too small for him. Tony said nothing, keeping his eyes on Bruce, who was looking around, eyeing the sock before purposefully not looking at his face. "We were disgruntled when we learned of your attack." Thor tried again, and Tony said nothing, not rising to the bait Thor was, horribly, setting out. "He means that we can't believe you did that." Bruce sighed, leaning one hand on the table where he tapped out something, probably in anxiety. Tony still said nothing. If Fury wanted him to act all relieved, it was not going to happen. "We knew you didn't like Hammer, but killing him is a little by dash." "I didn't kill him," Tony shot out, halting Bruce through mid-sentence, and Tony gave a slight glare at Bruce, eyes on eyes. It hurt a little, his best science buddy not recognizing when he was telling the truth or lying. He expected a breakout, maybe a little Green Giant action, but being questioned? What was he supposed to do? Plead innocent for something he never did? Bruce held Tony's eyes, before flicking down towards his finger, which still tapped, and back up, as if urging Tony to have some strange fascination in the wonders of chewed-on nails. Tap tap tap, ta tap ta tap tap. What? Was he supposed to somehow decode a funky Pink Floyd drumbeat or something? Oh, decode the... Tony could have hit himself for how stupid he felt. "What about you? Why are you here?" Tony growled, looking at Thor in mock anger, trying to stall time while he decoded the message Bruce was using Morse code for. "T-I-K-N-O. You attacked one with no defense. I wish to see why a shield brother turned to the path of cowardice." Thor responded, making Tony want to scoff at him. "Natasha and Clint shot down people with no defense for a living. Did that make them a coward? W.I.O.U, D.I.D.N.T, D.O.I.T. Well, that was a relief. F.U.R.Y, W.O.N.T.L.E.T, O.U.T. Never mind. I told you I didn't kill him." Tony sighed, rubbing his temples. K.D.P.I.N.G, S.U.I.T, I.N, H.U.L.K.R. Surprisedface.m. Hulk's room? Why would they put it there? N.V.R, L.surprisedface.K, T.H.E.R.T. True. I wish to not see another close to I prefer the path of shadows. Come Man of Banner. He wishes none of us. Thor sighed, rising from his feet. Yeah, bye Tony. Bruce sighed, tapping increasing as he rose to his feet. Etus.C.A.P.E.L.D.T.D.R, S.surprisedface.N.C.R.T.F.U.L. Bruce turned, walking out, leaving Tony with a mismatched sentence. Tony blinked, groaning and letting his head fall back, looking up at the plain white ceiling that had lights that were persistently trying to burn his retinas. They escape, later, soon, careful. What did that mean? Did that mean that he would be able to escape later? Did the soon mean that it would be soon, or that he'd have to be careful soon? He blinked as the lights above dimmed slightly, flickering before they turned black, electricity falling and leaving his windowless room in pitch blackness. This is what he meant. Tony turned, twisting his wrists against the black net, hoping to any god he knew, and Loki just for kicks, that the power outage had short-circuited the electric wires that practically made this thing. He pulled, wriggling and wincing as the wires gave, broken and weakened from the electric pulse, and jumped to his feet, standing mostly on his left foot because the floor was cold on his one foot. I should just walk around with one sock. No, I look stupid. Tony used before yanking off his other sock and throwing it behind him as he made his way towards the door, arc reactor illuminating it. He heard footsteps and lunged to the side of the door, managing to hide just behind it as a man burst through, carrying a gun on his hip and a taser in his hand. What is it with electricity and these people? Tony thought with a scowl, grabbing the door and slamming it hard into the man who crumpled as if Thor had just patted his head. He practically jumped on the man, pulling on his coat and grabbing his visor as well as swapping breathes, but leaving his shoes. He slipped the gun onto his hip. He wasn't going to kill anybody, as long as a few windows didn't count, and the taser on his arm holster as he hid himself from view, looking like a normal S.H.I.E.L.D. agent and not at all of Iron Man. After all, he only had to get to the Hulk room. He walked out, using a cheap S.H.I.E.L.D.-issued flashlight as well as a few others to scan the hallways, mentally laughing at the idiots who left his room unguarded with an electric lock. He walked, looking as if he was making rounds as a few nerdy-looking scientists bustled by, holding flashlights while they tried to get inside a room. Tony's eyes lit up when he spotted Mr. Killinger amongst the group, cursing and glaring at the door nearest the back. "Sir, I need to ask you a few questions," Tony stated, standing behind the man who jumped and turned with a sigh, crossing his arms. "Protocol?" Again, he groaned and Tony hit a snicker, walking away from the group where only his flashlight and the sound of his and Mr. Killinger's footsteps made the hallway loud. "Now then, tell Nikki the next time I'm kidnapped and interrogated, send in a professional." Tony smirked, flipping the visor up so Killinger's eyes could widen at the BLD caked on his face before Tony knocked him out with the butt of the taser. Done and done. He snuck along, moving away from any shouting of any sort, although just when he could see the door, he heard conversation being heard from the small clearing just across from the door. "What do you mean? Someone knocked out our power. They're probably on the craft trying to find something, or get someone. They're after Stark? Doesn't matter. You take the south corridor, Thor, take the east. Bruce takes the west, Clint go to the hangar, and I'll take the north." Of all people, he gets freaking Natasha to have to patrol the corridor he's walking down. He sees her, and she is walking with a gun in one hand and a flashlight in the other. She looks at him with narrowed eyes, but says no further thing as she walks by. Tony almost exhales when he hears her turn and stop walking. He turns reflexively, seeing her staring at him with some suspicion in her eyes. "Where are your shoes?" she asks, and Tony mentally curses. He should have taken Killinger's. She's fast, spinning and kicking him in such way the cuts on his head open again and his visor clatters against the floor, and she turns, almost about to jump him as he yanks up on his holster, pulling out the taser and blindly firing it. He hears a muffled yelp and a loud thud as she hits the ground. He pries one eye open, wanting to laugh as he sees her on the ground with an expression of shock and surprise with the taser lines connecting to her gut and expanding down her left thigh. "A lucky shot. Stark," she grunted out, twitching with the electricity as her back arched, and Tony turned, hurrying into the Hulk room and spotting his suit inside a case with an electric code needed to open it. Fingers ready for hacking, he rushed over, about to press a button before pausing and lifting the case. "Huh? No electricity, no lock. Jarvis?" Tony asked once he slipped the helmet on over his head, finding the bracelets needed on the secret compartments near the glove's wrists, and slipping them on. He blinked, seeing the red diagrams light up before power was restored, allowing Tony to see the room as if it were day. "Sir. A pleasure to see you well again." "Yeah, well, we aren't in the clear yet." "Jarvis, lock onto the cufflinks. Can you deploy the suit?" Instead of answering, the suit instead took its job to attach, linking joints together and looking perfect, minus the few thin lines where the electricity heat had burned the paint off. "Okay, Jarvis, can you lock onto Bruce? With the current lack of electricity upon the helicarrier, any action you make, sir, will be noticed at once." "So what am I supposed to do?" Tony scoffed, and looked at the case in which the suit was in before. "Wait," Tony mumbled, approaching the case and tapping on the top, tracing the angle towards a wall where he knew Bruce would see, and walked over, gently carving dots and lines into the plaster, Morse code for 45 foot and 64. "Sir? Quadrants." Alert me if Bruce goes anywhere in Nova Scotia. He's allowed inside. I think we can trust him. Tony responded, taking one good look around before winding his arm back for a punch, and dug up the catwalk around the glass cage, finding the chute out to the open sky after a few seconds of digging. Jarvis? Tony asked, about to lunge into the sky. Your location is currently over New York City. The suit has not gone under any damage that will prevent your return. Miss Potts and Mr. Rhodes are located at your home and well. Perfect. Do me a favor and shut down all link to the Avengers Mansion. Cut off electricity, transfer your databanks to someplace else, shift them to Vancouver and feed me the information. Let's see how long S.H.I.E.L.D. can work without my or your help. Yes, sir. Thrusters deployed. And in a loud laugh, Tony jumped. Tony! Pepper cried, running out from the front porch as he landed on the black tarmac driveway. S.H.I.E.L.D's blaming me for the prison. Don't trust anybody. Tony responded, walking inside and right past Pepper, who was stunned enough to not exactly care at the moment. He walked inside, manually pressing the latch to release the suit, as he hadn't built a system yet. Rhodey appeared at the noise of dropping metal, and looked at Tony with something akin to worry as he scanned him up and down, offering a hand once he knew Tony was fine. Tough time? Rhodey asked, and Tony looked at him with an expression of affectionate annoyance. You have no idea. X. Tony frowned, sitting in his small lab and stretched his legs. He was currently sprawled out on a large couch next to his little cubby corner of holographic desks, each fitted with separate areas of research or the occasional global-wide overnight search. Currently, he was looking at the footage from the prison of the men walking in with the bulky repulsor-like weapons, firing on everything and yet in strategic areas. Whoever planned it out had enough information about Tony that it was beginning to unnerve him. Still looking over the footage? Tony looked up, meeting Pepper, who stood in the open doorway to the small lab, walking in as there was not any glass blocking him out from the rest of the world. I'm looking for something that will slip them up. Military training, assassin work, anything. Tony responded with a frown, mapping the movement of each footstep one of the men made, and Pepper sighed loudly on his right. He felt the couch dip as she sat next to him, offering him one of the mugs from the tray she had walked in. Coffee? He asked, and took a large gulp. Sweet. Caramel frappe? Pepper supplied, having to make it herself from the lack of outside communication. It stalled into a comfortable silence as the two sipped on their caramel frappes, looking around the small and cute lab casually. It's odd to see you down here without all of your helpers, Pepper smiled, and Tony snorted quietly with a small smirk. Not that I miss dummy, spraying me with fire extinguisher, or you having some addiction with knocking over my coffee cups? Butterfingers still dropping wrenches? Pepper asked lightly, and Tony just groaned, Pepper issuing a little giggle at his response. It was nice, he would admit. He hadn't had time to just sit there and relax with anybody, since after he had just finished making the Iron Man suit and hadn't used it yet. Since then, he was too busy hunting down his weapons, managing a company, repairing his suit, curing poisoning, fighting Loki and fighting a debatably worse Fury. He didn't know how long they sat there for, maybe a few hours until Pepper actually was able to drag him away from his work, momentarily stopping and bidding Rhodey a good night. He was stargazing, a hobby he picked up from his missions, and follow Pepper up to the MSTR suit. Then, they slept, that's it. Only sleeping. Was nice. The next morning, however, it was time to get busy. Rhodey and Tony were in a sports car, one of the few stocked, and was racing around the desolate high cliff roads of Nova Scotia, pulling tight turns and not once becoming dangerously close to the edge. Why are we out here, Tony? Rhodey asked after a few short, yet fast, minutes of silence, Tony's knuckles white as he was clenching the steering wheel so tight. I need to know if there is anything that I overlooked on SEORP. Tony responded, voice clipped as he made another tight turn, Rhodey hanging onto the handle attached to the car. Tony, why are you asking me? I'm not in on these secret organizations. He sighed, and Tony exhaled through his nose loudly, turning again to show a breathless sight through his windshield before a cliff hid it from sight. No, but you may know if they'd have any records on paper? Tony pointed out, and Rhodey frowned, looking out over the water. I'm not sure, Tony. It seems this whole organization isn't found in the US. Think I should try Canada? Tony asked, slightly amused. No, I'm thinking even further. Rhodey responded, looking at Tony and noticing his eyebrows lift in surprise. Further? You think Europe or something? I don't know, Tony. Rhodey sighed, and Tony pursed his lips, cranking the wheel in a fishtail before pulling to a stop right at the edge of the road, looking out over the water where a whale breached in the distance. I'm thinking about trying the black market. Maybe a few people can get information I can't find by hacking? Tony admitted after a few quiet seconds, and Rhodey looked at him in alarm. Tony, you can't do that. The government gets one whiff of that Iron Man suit and you're toast. Rhodey protested, and Tony turned, frowning and having a look on his face that Rhodey automatically knew related to a stupid idea. I wasn't planning on using the suit, he stated, hesitantly looking up at Rhodey after. Rhodey stared, then crossed his arms and lifted one eyebrow and giving a look that obviously stated, Are you kidding me? Tony, the moment you walk into a black market unprotected, you're going to get jumped by robbers, assassins, idiots that want your hair, mutants, hell if I know. Rhodey threw his hands in the air and Tony couldn't help but add his own snide comment. And Arpesis, don't forget them. Do you naturally have that little self-preservation, or do you have to work at it? Tony's lips twitched in a smile as he looked out over the water, noticing the view as Rhodey leant back, one hand over his eyes as he rubbed his temples. I'm thinking of contacting the X-Men, actually, Tony mentioned, causing Rhodey to spin in his chair and give him an astonished look. Tony, that's a worse idea than the black market. Hey, there's nothing wrong with them. Tony defended and Rhodey frowned. Yeah, sure, Tony. Go make a deal with mutant humanoids with the power to make you burst into flames. Tony gave a snort, and a small smile was on his lips as he leaned back. You'd be surprised. They aren't that bad. Besides, they owe me a few favors. Tony shrugged and Rhodey stared. You have deals with the X-Men? Rhodey deadpanned and Tony smirked, leaning back in his seat. Yup, I maybe built them a jet, and secret passages through their entire house, and a bunker. Rhodey stared before slamming his head back and closing his eyes, groaning up towards the ceiling of the car saying, Dear God, kill me now. Tony laughed, flooring and speeding around on the roads, doing a U-turn and speeding back to the small manor where he knew Pepper would be waiting for them. Maybe if he was extra lucky, she'd even have another one of those caramel frappes. He liked caramel frappes. X-X. Tony sat on his couch in the lab, holographic images from satellite feeds locking onto a single building and calling without using an actual phone number. Oh, how he loved technology. Hello. He smirked at the woman speaking and leant back further, convinced that he had the right house. Hi there. By any chance, is this the Xavier Institute for Higher Learning? Tony spoke cheerfully, the girl on the other end slightly more hesitant before responding. Who is this? Tony gave a small pout, crossing his arms in annoyance as the girl refused to name herself. Tony Stark, famous billionaire and Iron Man at your service? Tony grinned, and he heard the pause at the other end before the girl answered back. And with the government last time I checked. The name's Storm. Nice to meet you, Storm. And I actually need to speak with Charles if you don't me dash. We aren't helping the government. I'm not asking you to. Tony responded, cheerful voice dropping a few tones, and the girl instantly was on her way, taking the phone with her. He hummed on the couch, hearing faint static noises and broken words over the phone from the Gurch Storm, walking past other mutants probably. Speaking of mutants, it had been a while since he was last there. Hello. Charles. How are you, my favorite bald mind reader? Tony smirked, and on the other side, he heard a chuckle. Hello, Anthony. It has been a while, hasn't it? It has. Anyways, I need a small favor from you guys actually. Tony winced as soon as he said it, and the line on the other side was quiet. From me, personally, or from my students, Anthony? It depends on who knows what I'm looking for. Tony shot back, carefree attitude fading, and now the two were speaking in only firm tones. And what exactly are you looking for? Information, Tony stated, and there was another silence. Tony took this as his time to explain himself. A few weeks ago the Avengers fought a metal thing. Anyways, There's an organization that made the thing, and I'm trying to find them and stop them. Tony responded, and waited as Charles let out a sigh. Finding a secret organization that made one monster? This isn't your style, Anthony. They have weapons that are identical to my repulsors and use them to frame me into murdering innocents? Tony responded, and Charles was silent. I see, and this organization is called? Scorp. SRP. I've only found them on metal used by past enemies, starting back from just after I made the suit originally. Well, they've been watching you, haven't they? You have no idea. Tony growled out, and it had a steady silence Tony was used to as Charles took time to think. I've never heard of SRP. I'm sure you wish for a more in-depth search? I was going to ask around the black market, but for obvious reasons I can't. Tony bitterly stated, and another silence. Of course. I'll see what I can. Too. And if I am able to find anyone with information about this association, send them to me. I'll send you my location, but I'm keeping protocols in case someone breaks in. If anyone finds out where I am, Shield's going to be killing me. Tony dryly stated, and he heard a chuckle from Charles. Of course. I'll keep your location hidden. I'll probably send out some of my informers to tell you what we have found. I believe you met Storm? Yes, nice girl by the way. She is. She will most likely inform you in person as well as Jean, perhaps Scott or Logan if he returns by then. Anybody I'd recognize? Tony stated with a small smirk, and he heard the corresponding chuckle from Charles. Probably not. I must thank you for your help in the past. I hope we'll be able to return the favor. Thanks, Charles. Tony sighed into the phone, pulling it away once he heard the click that signaled a hung-up connection. Tony? He turned, looking at Rhodey, who appeared in the doorway with a frown on his face. Jarvis just reported something about a guy showing up at a Nova Scotia airport. Rhodey frowned, and Tony turned, ears perking up as he listened. Did you catch a name? Yeah. Someone called Bruce Banner. Bruce Banner was not good with small confined spaces, nor things that flew in the air. Any that involved both usually involved a panic attack and him waking up in some cornfield lacking necessary garments to be seen in the public with. After getting to the Stark Tower ahead of the rest of the seething and confused Avengers, Natasha the one seething, he had immediately moved to a computer, asking Jarvis to open a folder that had the energy samples of the odd weapons Tony had insisted the people that had framed him used. He waited, noticing with a frown as the lights were off. Not even a slight hum of electricity as Jarvis seemed completely void of life, causing Bruce to wander around, feeling for a SW and flicking it on as he moved his way into the lab, the door unlocked. Moving to a single monitor, his breath hitched as it displayed a single address, one that he recognized as Tony's private jet house, ready for a moment's flight anywhere. In addition, apparently, the jet was already informed of his arrival. Thankfully, Bruce didn't have many attachments to belongings and was quickly on his way out the door, calling a taxi over as he shifted his single bag to a more comfortable position as he tossed it into the cab beside him. The ride was uneventful. The driver did not ask why he was at some random jet hangar on the outskirts of the city, and just to add to it, didn't recognize him, letting him have a few minutes of peace that wasn't filled with a gushing fangirl, or guy in this case. When he was on the steps up to the jet, there was a flight attendant in a short skirt with a quick yet tidy bun looking him over with pursed lips, painting a startling scarlet that matched her shirt. "We have been waiting for you, Mr. Banner, am I correct?" she asked, looking him up and down, and he shifted, not liking the intimidating stare she was giving him. That's me. Dr. Bruce Banner." He offered a hand, but she made no move to meet it, sniffing slightly at the single slightly beaten duffel bag he brought with him. "Pleasure," she stated before turning and marching inside the jet, heels clicking in succession as she walked into the pilot's corner, sitting at the main seat and clicking the safety buckles. It took Bruce a few seconds to realize that she was the pilot, and he hurried inside, awkwardly throwing his bag in another of the lush comfortable chairs and sitting down, staring out the window as the door automatically clicked shut. The woman prepared a few pre-flight tests, moving the small flaps up and down before moving the jet slowly. Bruce's hands dug into the elter seats, nubby nails pressing deeply as he felt the plane lift and the following nausea and the sick feeling of his organs shifting inside him. "This is your pilot speaking." We are now at a safe flight altitude. You are now free to roam about the cabin. Beverages and snacks are within the snack area, and Mr. Stark provides televisions for your convenience. If you wish for any contact, please press and hold the red button on the left-hand side of the cabin to create an audio feed to my deck. Thank you. Bruce blinked, hearing the woman speak in her clipped tone as he eyed the button, gingerly pressing it and speaking once the small red light lit up. Hi. Where exactly are you taking me? Mr. Stark has given me direct orders to transport you. No information regarding your landing area is provided until we are over the Atlantic Ocean. Thank you. Atlantic Ocean? Was he in Europe? Bruce's throat seemed to clog as he swallowed quickly in some attempt to remove it, sitting heavily on a chair and holding his head in his hands, tugging harshly at the brown curls. A few hours on a plane, he could do this. Bruce had never been so happy to be out of a jet. It was a nice jet, very nice actually. He just didn't like flying, and he was sure that there were imprints from his nails on the LTHR armrests from both the takeoff and the landing. He winced, stretching out his shoulders as he grabbed his bag, throwing it over his back as he cautiously made his way down the thin aluminum stairway that led to the door. The pilot observed with a frown as Bruce touched ground, shoes sinking into the gravel on the side of the runway as he took a few seconds to observe his surroundings. They were on some sort of edge of a mountainside, the landing strip tucking nicely next to it as the trees picked up on the far side, making their way up the mountain while trees on the others sloped downward steadily, making their way to a cerulean blue ocean in the distance and far below, touching craggy peaks. Where am I? Bruce asked, looking out and at the pilot, who crossed her arms, looking bored. Maine? Vermont? Bruce tallied off with a frown, and before the woman could respond, a different voice cut through. Try Canada. Bruce spun, a smile on his face as he spotted Tony, at ease against a trussed convertible car, a t-shirt stained with oil and yet pulling off the look with designer sunglasses that weren't actually needed. Nova Scotia to be exact, they have fantastic lobster. Jarvis noted that the airport was picking up Kathy's signal. Thanks, Kathy. Tony smirked to the pilot, who craned her head in a nod, moving to dismantle the stairs and fly away again. Anyways, I have loads to tell you. Hop in, I'll explain some on the ride. Tony offered, using one arm to flip over the side and into the driver's seat with a fluid motion only experience could create. Bruce shuffled over, dropping his bag in the tiny trunk before easing into the convertible, buckling and tightening the strap a little more than usual, ignoring Tony's lifted eyebrow as he waited for said man to start to drive. Bruce fisted his hands in the belt as his eyes watered from the sudden speed, his breath caught while Tony continued rambling away, as if they were simply walking along on a sidewalk. Pepper and Rhodey are here. Rhodey nearly got hit by Scorp and I don't want to risk Pepper. Besides, Pep can manage SI from here. And since those SHIELD idiots don't know how to track half as well as they should, you're safe here? Tony flippantly called, taking a sharp left turn and down through one of the many tunnels that dotted the cliff faces. Here? Bruce questioned weakly, still confused at what just happened in the few hours since Tony had gotten away. From SHIELD. Nova Scotia Casa de la Stark. Small little thing, you'll have the fourth room, has an attached bath and all the things you need. Rhodey goes out to get things for us. Pepper's too noticeable and I'm not sure if the Avengers are well known in Canada, but I know that a billionaire isn't something you'd ignore. Tony rambled, Bruce blinking and giving a slow, bewildered nod. They took another sharp turn on a road that Bruce didn't even see at first, pulling up to a cliff edge where a house sat, a glass wall keeping the edge a good 4 feet away as Tony pulled into the small, for him, garage, parking next to another convertible, some sort of Camaro, and an out-of-place Honda. For Rhodey, Tony explained when he noticed Bruce's pointed look, and he slid to a stop, garage door sliding closed behind while bright white lights lit up, Bruce grabbing his bag and hurrying after Tony who was already at the door. Basic rules, we can't have anyone out here cleaning up for us, so don't make a huge mess, not like you do, neat freak. Tony mock scowled as he walked past, tossing his keys on a glass shelf just on the left of the door, letting Bruce look around, eyeing the small living room with the glass wall looking out over the ocean. It's appealing, he breathed, causing Tony to mock scowl. And my tower isn't? Nah, I know what you mean. Tony smiled, and Bruce blushed slightly, hesitantly sitting down next to Tony, who practically flung himself onto one of the couches. "Tony, have you gone in?" "Oh, hello, Bruce," Pepper awkwardly stated, walking in and holding a pile of recently printed papers, a pen sitting just behind her ear while she watched, hesitantly walking closer. "I need you to sign these. It's about the charity event in Bodash." "Don't care." Tony shrugged, taking the offered pen and quickly scribbling his name while Pepper retreated, Bruce giving her a small smile as she vanished around the corner of the building. "Anyways, thanks for helping me out back on the helicarrier. I'm positive Fury's little minions won't even think to use Morse code. How did you get those lights anyways?" Tony asked, the sudden rambling directing Bruce's attention to the man himself. "Oh, I found the breaker room." "You turned off the light SW?" Tony deadpanned in shock and yet awe. Bruce blushed, giving a slight nod before Tony fell back against the couch, cackling madly. "Those idiots didn't even check the light SW. The best the world has to offer, my butt." Tony cackled, causing Bruce to join in on a little bit of the laughter. "Sir, if I may interrupt. Sirs Odinson, Rogers, Barton and Miss Romanoff are attempting access into the tower." "Oh, visual please, thanks Jar," Tony nonchalantly stated, putting his arms behind his head as the TV across lit up with a security feed, oddly in color and with audio for a dumb old device. "This is what Jarvis sees, you can't see those ones," Tony explained as they watched the group march in, Natasha limping ever so slightly as she looked around with a frown. "Jarvis, can you get the lights?" "Nothing. Absolutely nothing happened." "You didn't?" Bruce exhaled, the slightest twitch of a smile on his face from the confused and annoyed looks on the others. "Jarvis? Told anybody Hoth Dimon Stark. He probably deactivated his entire tower." Clint cursed, walking forward and pressing on a door that was electrically locked, and Tony watched him strain, trying to push it open while his efforts did nothing. "Shut down every single command, can't wait for Thor to figure out the toaster won't work," Tony stated smugly, Bruce watching in awe as the others struggled to do the smallest tasks they had all taken for granted. "Damn, it's Stark. I'm going to hogtie you and leave you in Fury's office," Clint cursed, moving around before dropping onto the couch with a scowl. The suits are gone as well as all of his robots and blueprints from his lab. This place is literally a wasteland. Jarvis is out as well as the power. This place has nothing for us, Natasha stated, appearing in the stairway to the lab, and Steve frowned, looking around. "So what? Do we go and rent an apartment? Without Stark's money? We won't be able to pay for it." It was quiet as they waited, thinking over something, somehow a way to solve the problem. "Oh no, we're going to have to bunk with Fury. Friends, the Pop-Tarts are missing." CRP. It was maybe a week after Bruce's original visit, and the four of them hadn't left the area since. Pepper was using Jarvis to update reports and send them from a Russian satellite to a British one, before to a number of computers, before to the US's, then finally to where the reports were supposed to be. It effectively left the idiots at S.H.I.E.L.D. baffled and scrambling to have any slight idea. Tony hacked into their server nearly every other day, and Jarvis monitored it in case something major happened in the odd day they weren't watching the security feeds. Bruce was enjoying Nova Scotia. He was rather fond of just looking out over the cliff edge, and no matter how many times Tony offered to take him cliff jumping, he seemed to have something against suddenly skinny dipping. Although Tony stressed that there was nobody here, in this barren rocky chunk of Canada. Rhodey was enjoying his quiet break-off, and was more often than not off on his own, driving around the cliffs at a painstakingly slow speed of the speed limit. "Anyways, the gold infused with the titanium dash," Tony started, explaining exactly why he liked using the alloy he did in the suit to Bruce before Jarvis cut him off, speaking from the TV speakers, as he hadn't installed any in between the walls yet. "Sir? You have an incoming call." "From who?" Tony spoke, voice immediately changing from the playful tone before to something clipped and icy, causing Bruce to look at him in alarm from the sudden change. "The call is incoming from a mobile cell phone, located in northern New York. Lock on and narrow the target, Jarvis," Tony ordered, watching the screen that slowly narrowed down the search. "On the corner of Graymalkin Lane and Worcester Street, sir." Hack into the phone, disconnect the call if you have to, look through contact information, tell me if there's anyone on it that we know. Tony ordered, and Bruce frowned. Tony, that's an invasion of privacy. You can't just do the dash. Sir, contacts in the phone relate to those of known mutants as well as a few exceptions. Code names are included as well as profile pictures. Any idea on whose phone it is right now? Tony asked, completely ignoring Bruce and focusing on the screen as pictures of mutants flicked past. Owner of the phone is known as Jean Grey, mutant and teacher at Charles Xavier School. Okay'd feed her through. Tony nodded and the screen blinked, a dial tone feeding through before it was immediately picked up. Hello? I'm trying to reach someone. And I think you did. The name's Tony Stark. Tony offered, speaking aloud while the girl on the other side inhaled sharply, obviously not the Jean who owned the phone. Tony Stark? Well, sorry, Mr. Stark. Anyways, the professor told Jean to tell you, but she was busy, so she let me tell you. Tell me what? Tony asked, leaning forward on his seat while the girl on the other end obviously noticed how. The professor used Cerebro and found someone who knew about that thing you were looking for, SEORP. But that's the odd thing dash. There was only one person, Tony muttered, and the girl on the other end was quiet as he thought. What else? Sure. You'd tell me more if you were to call me, Tony added, and the girl exhaled. Yet? Yeah, friend of mine. He's off to confront that guy. He's a mutant, Mr. Stark. He's making it so the professor can't get a read on him, so he sent in my friend to meet with him. Meet with him? Tony quoted, and he had the mental image that the girl had winced. Yet it's a black market, some pub that has cage fighting. Cage fighting? Bruce piped up, sitting forward suddenly. He never did like cage fighting. The girl laughed, and when she responded, it was with a smile in her voice. Oh, don't worry about him. He's a pro at fighting. How do you think I met him? In a pub out on the sides of eastern Alberta, a tiny shack of a pub sat. A single man got off a chopper, a rather nice one at that, and walked towards the building, sniffing once and grimacing at the thick smell of body odor and cheap beer, the thick haze of cigarette smoke making the bar seem hazy in the light. He moved throughout, around the scantily clad woman who pouted at his rejection, and moved across the room, sniffing and eyes peeled for a certain person he had been sent on this wild goose chase for. This better be good, he grumbled, waving down the barman who slid down a large mug with the cheap beer, the mug mostly foam, but still managed to slosh over the top onto the horrid-smelling countertop. He heard a bell ring behind him, and turned to shortly watch the fight. Lazily, he could point out 3 problems before one landed a punch, and it was rather pathetic in his mind actually. He pointed to a rather scrawny-looking kid who was obviously trying to snatch money out of people's pockets. At once, the kid attempted to look innocent, but the man just sighed, grabbing his shirt and pushing him to the counter, the boy not even giving a yelp despite how large his eyes got on his rat body. Looking for a guy. Calls himself Weasel. The man grunted, and the rat kid gulped loudly, lifting one shaking hand and pointing towards the back booths, where the man could faintly pick out 2 forms, one of the scantily clad girls and a rather grimy-looking person amazingly enough bearing resemblance to a weasel. Thanks, bub, get out of here before the cops show. The man grunted, shoving the kid towards the door who squeaked and scurried away, rushing right out of the doors. The man moved, taking the beer with him as he pulled up a chair, dropping the beer onto the table across from the 2, and sat down, staring at the 2 for a moment before taking a long drink from the mug and setting it down with the clang, perfectly at ease with the loud shouts and occasional BLD on the ground atmosphere. Yes? The man asked, scowling and pinching his lips together in a very impressive weasel impression, and the man took another sip, leaning back and staring. You weasel? He grunted out, the other man blinking slyly and giving a slow nod in which the lady scowled, crossing her arms on her dirty white fox fur scarf. Good, listen here, bub, you're gonna tell me what I want, right now? The man stated, taking another gulp of the cheap liquid, and the man lifted an eyebrow, not impressed. Oh. The man reached across, grabbing the weasel and slamming him onto the table, beer spilling onto the splinter-covered plywood cover while the girl screamed in alarm as Weasel was suddenly pinned to the table by a much taller, buff man. Not to mention the two long silver knives that seemed to press into the sides of his neck, the middle blade inches away from his gasping throat. Now then, the man stated at ease, pulling out a cigar and lighting it by slashing one of his other blades into another, doing it with such ease it screamed, "Experience!" Weasel looked around, eyes scanning all over, and he mentally cursed himself over the fact that he chose the most hidden corner, and his telepathic partner had run off with his wallet. We gonna do this the easy way or the strong way? It was a few days after the original cell phone call from the mysterious stranger. Jarvis had hacked into a few security feeds, matching the audio to that of a young girl, taped while visiting a local museum for some school trip. Apparently, she went by the name Rogue, although Tony was positive that was not her real name. Tony and Bruce had been busy for the first day, the later avoiding the former as he had been upset with the lack of rights Tony had represented while phoning the younger girl. Bruce had told Tony when he asked what he was doing in the makeshift lab, that he was looking up the mutant gene to see if it could have a possible cure for his issue. In all reality, he was looking up the medical diagnosis for narcissism, trying to see if there were any temporary cures. Bruce flipped through the thick book he had, fingers flying as his eyes scanned any page for a word that could add to the sudden coldness to Tony's attitude. Sure, Bruce noticed that the narcissistic tendencies were developing slowly, but turning harsh cold in only a single night? That was wrong. Different from manic-depressive psych. Bruce froze, moving back the 4 pages he flipped and narrowed his eyes, nearly brushing his nose against the small font as he skimmed, searching for the promising-looking sentence. Narcissists go through euphoric and dysphoric cycles. Jarvis, scan the definition of dysphoric. Bruce stated calmly, looking up as a nearby monitor flashed to life, the definition in helpful large font. Dysphoric, dysphoria, depression, a state of feeling acutely hopeless, uncomfortable, and unhappy. Bruce swallowed back the horribly sick feeling in his throat and continued to read, determined to find a cure. They are dilated, all-encompassing, all-consuming, and all-pervasive. They are different from manic-depressive cycles, as found in the bipolar disorder page 607, in which they are reactive, highly dependent on external events or circumstances. No. Bruce whispered, pulling out a dictionary and quickly skimming the rest of the passage and picking out a few key words, quickly searching it in the medical terms. Anhedonia, a mental disorder, the inability to gain pleasure from normally pleasurable experiences. Mania, abnormal elevated or irritable mood or energy levels. At the few words Bruce started to desperately read the passage, mouth growing dry as he looked at the irritable mood swings that Tony was already on. These mini-cycles, though outwardly manic-depressive, are not. They are the result of subtle fluctuations in the volatile flow of narcissist supply. These mini-cycles, though outwardly manic-depressive or cyclothymiacs, are not. They are the result of subtle fluctuations in the volatile flow of narcissistic supply. Narcissistic supply, the balance of admiration, adoration, approval, attention, and so on throughout activities, thoughts, conversations, inspiration, and daydreams. All aspects of life are regulated throughout such supply, rendering it relatively stable and predictable. No. Bruce croaked, more and more, the information looking bleak. Is there something wrong, Dr. Banner? Bruce jumped at Jarvis' tone, inquiring as he was obviously stressed. Bruce sighed, lifting his arms to rub his eyes when he noticed that they were shaking. Yet, can you tell me the last time Tony slept? He asked, best to start by knowing which CYCL Tony was on, anyways. Jarvis gave a pause before answering. Mr. Stark is currently inside his lab. He has been awake for 32 hours straight. Bruce paused, waiting and thinking his next answer. Do you think he's hungry? I could make him some food, Bruce offered, and Jarvis didn't wait nearly as long this time. I do not think this wise, Dr. Banner. Mr. Stark is currently in a foul mood, unable to invent anything at the moment. And Bruce felt that chill, that horrible feeling he got when he knew something the others didn't. Tony was on the negative side of the CYCL. Great. Okay, that's fine. Do you know where Pepper and Rhodey are? Bruce asked, shifting in his seat awkwardly, while Jarvis scanned the house quickly. Mississippi Potts and Mr. Rhodes are currently inside the lounge. Thanks, Jarvis. Bruce smiled, making his way out and around the corner from the small area he was reading in. Indeed, the two were inside the lounge. Pepper was going over paperwork while Rhodey was reading a book, and all the while, the TV was on mute, the bright flashing colors stunning Bruce for a small second. Oh, hello, Bruce. Pepper smiled, looking up with a smile as Bruce shuffled in, awkwardly perching on one of the couch's seats, looking at the two. So, anything new? He asked, looking to the TV and inwardly wincing at how idiotic his conversation attempt sounded. Nothing unusual. A new superhero showed up in New York, shoots webs like a spider or something. He's managed only the small attacks, mostly thugs and robberies. Rhodey shrugged and Bruce looked up to see said red and blue adorned human swing across buildings using webs with an incredibly tacky spider print on the middle of his heroes these days. Yeah, could I show you guys something outside? Bruce asked attentively, not exactly sure on what ground. Pepper stared, looking at him once before looking at the nearly set sun and fading light before looking back at him and lifting an eyebrow. Sure. Rhodey stated, obviously confused as he got off the couch, setting the book on the cushion and walking after Bruce while Pepper followed, frowning at the obvious events. Bruce walked out, standing momentarily on the porch before walking further out, knowing that Jarvis wouldn't automatically have an audio feed in such a new residence. Pepper gave a disgruntled sigh as she carefully started to walk across the gravel driveway in her impressive heels, following Bruce as he settled on leaning against the railing a fair distance away, which overlooked the cliff, faces and the churning waters below. What is it, Bruce? Rhodey asked, shifting and leaning against the fence while Bruce nervously wringed his hands. This is odd to ask, but what? Pepper sighed, looking up at the sky as something akin to storm clouds were very slowly growing closer. Did Tony ever go to see therapists after he came back from Afghanistan? Pepper and Rhodey blinked, Pepper giving a strangled cough as she cleared her throat. I don't see how you need to know anything about the Pepper, Bruce stated quietly and yet firmly, causing her to silence immediately when she caught the slightly haunted look in his eyes. It's important. They stared, Rhodey not answering as Pepper finally choked a slight coughing sob noise as she sniffed, answering curtly even though it hurt her obviously. Oh. He didn't want us to take him to one. He refused to meet with anybody, insisted that he was fine. She coughed and Bruce bit his lip looking out over the water. Was he? He asked quietly and it was silent, nothing before Rhodey answered. He was better than we expected. He didn't freak on us, he didn't scream or break down, he could have never gone if we didn't know better. Rhodey scoffed, and Bruce's hand tensed ever so slightly. He has PTSD, he's an aquaphobic now. He doesn't do well with hospitals and surgery. He doesn't like it when people shout at him in that language. Never got him to tell us the name of it. Pepper mused, a twisted laugh transformed into a sob as it left her mouth. Is that what you wanted to talk to us about? Him and that? Rhodey asked, and Bruce slowly shook his head, dropping down until his elbows were leant against the railing, head cradled in his hands. No. Bruce hesitated, and the two watched him carefully. He nearly choked, trying to find a way to say it. Shield has files on everyone. They never really did proper testing, but a few professionals observed, and a few doctors managed to analyze his patterns. It's not completely positive, but it's in the 70 to 90% range that they're right. He rambled, choking off and looking at Pepper and Rhodey, the former who was increasingly getting worried. Bruce? What is it, Bruce? Is it about Tony? Oh God, it's about Tony, isn't it? Bruce swallowed and looked out over the water, biting his lip before blurting out what he never wanted to say to anyone. Tony's diagnosed with NPD. He blurted, mentally smacking himself before looking at the two others, noticing Rhodey's frown and Pepper's confused face. NPD? Bruce, what does it? Pepper trailed off, arms flopping uselessly to her side. It's a personality disorder. It's known as narcissism. Bruce offered, and they stared, a silent moment while they looked at each other in the eye, not speaking but merely thinking. I know Tony's many things, but he is not a . I'm sorry, Rhodey. It's not the term they throw around. Bruce struggled and Pepper frowned, bottom lip quivering ever so slightly, before she drew her phone out of her pocket. "Jarvis," she asked quietly, the screen flicking alive as Bruce looked at it unsure. Would he tell Tony? "Tell me everything there is to know about narcissism." She spoke, voice a near whisper as the screen flashed blue, files branching and opening, loading and closing once more. "Yes, Mrs. Potts. According to the databanks of the Mayo Clinic dash." "What's that?" Rhodey interrupted, and Jarvis took a few seconds to find an appropriate answer. "It is one of the largest treatment facilities in the world for rare or unusual illnesses. According to the databanks, narcissistic personality disorder is a mental disorder in which people have an inflated sense of their own importance and a deep need for admiration. Those with narcissistic personality disorder believe that they're superior to others and have little regard for other people's feelings. But behind this mask of ultra-confidence lies a fragile self-esteem, vulnerable to the slightest criticism." Pepper stared at her phone, and Rhodey clenched his hand on the railing, knuckles turning white as his whole arm trembled. "Would you like to hear the rest of the information? Jarvis, can you tell us the causes?" Pepper asked quietly, clearing her throat to speak louder after a brief pause. "The Mayo Clinic does not have an in-depth research on how the disorder is created. According to them, as with other mental disorders, the cause is likely complex. The cause may be linked to a dysfunctional childhood, such as excessive pampering, extremely high expectations, abuse, or neglect. It's also possible that genetics or psychobiology, the connection between the brain and behavior and thinking, plays a role in the development of narcissistic personality disorder." Rhodey cussed, head dropping and Pepper dropping her phone onto the ground as she now actually had real sobs racking from her body. Bruce felt a slight tremble as he reached down and gingerly picked up the phone, Jarvis now understanding what was happening. "I apologize, Mrs. Potts. Long-lasting effects of this disorder include abuse of substance, alcohol, depression, suicidal thoughts, relationship problems, or other disorders." By this time, even Bruce was taking deep breaths to try and steady his offset emotions. During somewhere of this time, rain had started to fall, a thick curtain of black drawing the sky near midnight as Pepper tried to use the rain as an excuse as to why she was crying. "Shit, Tony," Rhodey murmured, obviously blaming himself for never noticing. "Why didn't I ever notice, Tony? Why didn't I notice that you were hurt like me inside, that you were just as messed up as I am?" Bruce's mind subconsciously whispered, and he shook his head, trying to get the leaking thoughts to vanish with the rain. A crack of lightning non-Thor made lit up the area, causing the nearby surroundings to be alit shortly with a brilliant display of light before it vanished. A teeth-crunching roar as it slammed into a mountain in the distance. "We should probably go inside dashed," Pepper started, stopping as she froze, Bruce looking in the same moment as another flash of lightning alit the ground again. And Tony, who stood on the porch, dripping and eyeing the trio with eyes filled with a glazed dull shock, and something even worse, acceptance. He didn't move as water soaked through his thin t-shirt, or how his usually well-tamed hair clung to his face in wet shaggy clumps, and then, the lightning faded, another roar and silence. "Tony! Tony Cumbadash," Rhodey shouted, lightning lighting the areas with such clarity it took Rhodey's breath away. Tony was gone, and Bruce trembled slightly, trying to rid himself of the image of Tony staring from the shelter of the porch overhang, safe from any raindrops falling on his face for a while. "He must have stepped out to hear us. He must have," Bruce's mind added, prodding his almost frozen thought process. Yes, that would be the only reason why he had drops running down his cheeks. Tony was in his car, driving at an insane speed down the road with his suit in the back, folded up, mind you, countless blueprints and a few dozen electronics that he required. It wasn't the fact that the others found out he had narcissism, nah, he had found that out a long time ago. There was a time, such a long time ago, when Obadiah actually cared for him. When Obi would willingly go out of his way to make Tony happy, there was a time when Obadiah was the only one who cared for him. Obadiah wanted to make sure that he was okay. After the sudden death of his mother and his father, he really didn't care for that BSTRD, and signed him up to meet with a psychologist, making sure that the sudden problems wouldn't affect him or the company later on in life. He was diagnosed with narcissistic behavior, only mild at that point of time. Then he ripped his heart out, walking away laughing and leaving Tony to die far behind, both literally and metaphorically. He had noticed that his tendencies had increased in that time frame since Afghanistan, Obadiah's betrayal, his looming death, Vanko's attack, and more recently Loki's manipulative nature. He had noticed the signs, and he didn't care. It wasn't like the palladium poisoning, where he could take a small BLD test and see how long he had to live left. This wasn't going away. To be frank, he didn't understand why it was such a big deal. Sure, some narcissist turned suicidal, but he was over that. Having an ignoring and slightly abusive dad, a mother who expected too much of you, no friends, kidnappings, and Capitan America, it was a wonder he never actually used his courage to kill himself in his childhood. Sir? You are nearing the New Brunswick border. Jarvis warned over the car's stereo system, causing Tony to blink and notice that the cliff faces had changed into rolling plains and large windmills every so often. Thanks, Jar. Any way you can open up the line for me, I don't want to stop. He muttered quietly. And Jarvis didn't say anything as in the distance. The toll line flashed green and one of the open lines moved automatically for him, and he blared through, people screaming behind him to stop. He wasn't going to stop. Not now, not ever. He blew right down the road. The sound of the deep engine purring was his only noise, not even music could distract his thoughts. Sir? Do you have an intended location? Jarvis managed to ask through the system, and Tony said nothing, eyes focused and narrow while his knuckles were white with how tightly they clenched the steering wheel. No. He cut out shortly, and Jarvis was quiet a moment. May I suggest a number of cities in the near vicinity? Fredericton is NERB-. No, that's too close. What's the nearest city out of this province? Tony asked carelessly, passing a small white car with a roar, as he was easily 20 over the speed limit. Trans-Canada Highway extends further along New Brunswick before forking off into Maine, and continuing along the border along the St. Lawrence River and meeting with Quebec City. I'll go to Quebec City. I don't think Fury knows I can speak French. Pepper won't tell anyone besides Bruce, and he doesn't know how to search for people in cities, not to mention visit them. Tony muttered under his breath, passing another car while Jarvis wisely did not speak, understanding how precarious this situation was. It was hours of fast driving when Tony finally saw the skyline glowing in the distance, casting bright lights in the sheer darkness of the highway and roads separating it from the side of the river he was on. He turned, quickly traveling under the bridge that reminded him of the Mackinac Bridge, surprisingly cleaner, and drove into the city, at once bypassing the traffic with skill only he could possess. I have rented the top suite of the Chateau Frontenac for you, sir, Jarvis stated while Tony automatically turned, having recognized his hotel name from all of those Canadian business trips. Tony Stark did not mind the Canadians. Many of his colleges had made crude jokes about Canadians. How many Canadians does it take to screw in a light bulb? How many does it take to chip it out of the ice? However, Tony didn't feel that way in the slightest. He had met Italian executives, Russian inventors, Bulgarian biologists, Australian doctors, and yet, it seemed that every culture had a rich aristocrat that seemed too rude for words. Except for Canada, it was impossible how nice they were. The last time he was here to meet the Prime Minister, he ended up having dinner. The Prime Minister paid the bills he did, inviting him to a banquet, and then inviting him to coffee, in which Tony had to bribe the local coffee waitress to take his money and not the man's. He rather liked Canada, if he could say so himself. Out of all his favorite places to live, Canada was a close second to the US. The nearby location had nothing to do with it either. He pulled into the parking loop where a young man awaited, ready to help him unload and carry his bags for him. I got this. Tony nodded, taking his suitcase, Iron Man, suitcase, and walking up while one drove his car to parking and the other carried his strong metal shell suitcase with his actual clothes. Inside the elevator, the boy looked at him once with a small grin before asking, "Are you Tony Stark?" In which Tony gave a small sigh and nodded, awaiting the bombardment of questions or requests for autographs. Instead, the boy just smiled a little wider, stepped out of the elevator, and held his door open to the largest suit in the building. "You aren't going to ask for an autograph?" Tony asked, bemused with the frown the boy suddenly brought to his lips. "Oh, you look tired. Was a pleasure meeting you." He grinned, gently setting his suitcase down and almost skipping away to help another couple with their bags. Tony stared, eventually sighed and muttering under his breath over how stubborn 2 nice Canadians. With an affectionate laugh and closing the door behind him, dropping onto the plush white bed with a vicious lunge, landing among the soft pillows and nearly passing out just by how good it felt. He loved Canada. X-X. The next day he was working, room a complete mess with papers and clothes scattered among the sliding door that created his room. He looked up at the soft knock at his door, and frowned as he answered it yawning although it was nearly noon. He blinked as he looked at the middle-aged lady, who was holding a tray of different sorts of foods as well as one of those cute little maple sugar tarts just because she could probably. She blinked with oddly bright almost yellow-brown eyes and smiled, holding the tray and rapidly firing off French with a slightly English accent. "Good afternoon, Mr. Stark. I believe it was your AI that informed us that you forget the added room service?" She beamed, and gently moved in the room, not even batting an eye at the mess as she set the food on the glass table, and gently moved a few coffee cups aside and eyed the shortage in grains. "Do you require more coffee, Mr. Stark? Any preference?" she asked, noticing that the iced coffee was untouched. No iced coffee, please," he added, wincing at how the words were forced in his exhaustion. Normally he was able to speak so fluidly. "Of course." She nodded with a grin, although frowned a few seconds after. "If you wish, another maid could bring you your coffee. Would you prefer if she spoke English? No. It's fine. I promise. I can speak all sorts of languages, it's really no problem," he assured with a grin while running his hands through his hair to mess it up further. "Yes, Mr. Stark. Enjoy your time. I must recommend the park this time of season. The leaves are just beginning to fall," she added, quietly walking out and closing the door behind as he blinked, yawning again and dumping out a cup of already cold coffee that was more creamer than coffee left. "Jarvis? You told the hotel to send me food?" he asked, slightly annoyed as Jarvis' voice came from the TV system. "He hooked him up a few hours ago." "Yes, sir. I was programmed to look after your well-being," Jarvis replied, and Tony sighed, poking some sort of thick slices of ham that was edged with some sort of yellow crust. "Jar, what is this?" "I believe that is referred to as back bacon." Tony stared, picking up a piece of the meat hesitantly before taking a large bite and chewing thoughtfully before swallowing with a frown. "Jarvis, this is just ham. X-X. The house cleaner was right, it was peeling out. The park was beginning to lose leaves and the sky was alit with thousands of shades of vibrant yellows and deep reds that drifted and flashed in his eyes at the softest chill. He sat on a marble bench, looking at the kids that laughed and ran around as they jumped in a large leaf pile the park attendant was blowing together for them. He was laughing although they were probably making his job much harder. A few women were out walking large fit dogs, and a few couples walked around, thick earmuffs and cute scarves around their necks as they had their hands intertwined and swung with a laugh and exaggerated movements. He felt like he was intruding as he had his hands nestled deep in his pockets, watching the park where a little girl, maybe 7 years old, walked alongside her dad, the resemblance too similar to be a coincidence while they looked sad, the man wearing a ring while there was no sign of a wife in sight. He sighed, looking away from the sad and obviously poor two as they trudged through the yellow and orange fallen leaves, girl handing onto his much larger hand with tiny dirty mittens while he had a ripped jacket on. "Hey," he called, the two looking over while he got up, his status in society obvious with his fancy Altucher jacket and expensive shoes. "Here," he nodded, handing over a quickly scrawled note, and the man's widened eyes said a story of their own while he smiled in gratitude, walking off with a much happier mood with the confused little girl trailing behind. But Tony felt sick. He didn't feel anything. He looked at the two and felt nothing, not the slightest remnants of being upset by the display, or a feeling of sympathy over what the two were lacking. He felt nothing. And that's what concerned him. Was he getting worse? Was he losing all links of empathy to anyone? He didn't feel anything towards those two, or feel the joy he was sure he would usually when looking at the playing kids. He only felt slight remnants of jealousy over the two laughing couple, and a larger pang as he saw a little family of a happy man, wife, and little boy wearing a cute little windbreaker with flushed cheeks. He gave those two money for the hint of anything. Shouldn't he feel proud of what he had done? Shouldn't he feel happy? Feel anything, something that should relate to how one felt after donating to charity? He felt numb, and he continued walking across the streets, past a few shop windows with expensive dresses and jewelry for women as they bustled around in the increasing chill in the air. He sighed, crossing the streets towards a less populated area where he saw something move quickly and a loud clashing bang from an alley. A homeless man? No, there weren't any on the streets here. That was nearly impossible. He moved closer to the alley to see what it was and relaxed with a sigh, looking at the tipped garbage can and the black cat that sat attentive on the lid of a recycling bin, watching his with much to clear green intelligent eyes. Hey there. He sighed, some part of him hoping to find something to attack. He was disappointed it was only a mangy street cat. It narrowed its eyes, which drew Tony's eyes to it again with a frown. It wasn't a street cat, it was much too tidy and hygienic, not to mention the tip of a fong pushing out from its lips was pristine ivory white, cleaner than any he had seen on an animal before, also the long thin body of the creature that managed to avoid looking anorexic. Cat. He grumbled, mentally slapping with how attentive he was to the animal before turning and stalking away, ignoring the way it bared its teeth angrily, claws sliding out and digging into the clean plastic as it clawed something loudly and tantalizingly slowly. Tony stopped, hesitating before continuing and walking away, shaking his head and muttering under his breath as the cat's nostrils flared in annoyance with how Tony had ignored it. The cat hissed, looked down at the green plastic frowning with the crude words carved into the lid. SRP. No, the cat decided, tail snapping around angrily from the alley. I'll look harder. It concluded, jumping down and padding towards the back fence, jumping up and landing gracefully, claws extended to help balance itself before it sprang again. A puff of blackened feathers fell as a large silky raven cawed loudly, taking to the skies. X-X. Tony's head craned up, looking immediately to the one window that had the blinds drawn. He was working with holographs and didn't want any glares on the screens. He blinked, getting slowly to his feet and approaching the window warily. Paranoia had gotten to him at this point. He drew closer, then finally just as he was reaching out for the blinds, the door knocked and he spun. He yanked the blinds back, blinking at the harsh sunlight before frowning, mentally smacking himself. What could be there? The ledge was 6 inches if that. Nothing could get that, plus the fact he was on the top floor. The door knocked again and Tony turned, opening it to the French-Canadian house cleaner he had grown used to, carrying her signature tray and his dinner. She smiled, setting the tray down before vanishing once more, leaving Tony to his work. Over the 2 weeks he had been there, he had accomplished very little. Xavier had contacted him once more. It wasn't a casual visit or anything after all. The idea of a bald paralyzed telepath concerned him slightly. It wasn't that he had anything against mutants, he was just cautious with their power. The fact that they were incredible at getting information was just an added bonus. Xavier had reported to him one of his friends? Student? Tony wasn't sure, named Wolverine. Tony hacked a little into an old government file that was experimenting on mutants. Turns out some guy named Logan was codename Wolverine. They did something with metal and his bones. Tony didn't really care to read further. Had found information from a guy in the black market who knew about SEORP. It wasn't much to go on, if anything. He found out the acronym and what it stood for. Security Communications over Ruin Procedures. What that meant, Tony had the faintest clue. He had it written down carefully, as well as other information Jarvis had been able to copy from the call. Having a running script came in handy. SRP, as far as he could tell, was the glue that made all evil villains and weapon projects possible. Tony assumed that he hadn't known much about it while he was designing weapons, was because his weapons were already successful enough without SORP's interference. How they had contacted Obadiah was unknown, how they had contacted Hammer was unknown, but they obviously were watching him if it meant framing him with Hammer's death. SORP was good, but an agency created on the sole purpose of funding and helping people with weapons seemed a little contradictory. Supplying weapons and other building materials to smaller businesses was almost asking for a betrayal move. attacking them and destroying SRP. Yet again, Hammer's reaction was so horrified. It implied that perhaps SRP was something to be feared as an entity rather than a business. SRP had created a living, breathing mechanical monster that the Avengers had fought. That meant somebody was targeting the Avengers and used SCORP's resources to create the thing, but that wouldn't match up with Tony's framing and attack. That meant that SRP was after him, but why him? If anything, it would more likely be sent after Natasha, knowing hell knows how many countries wanted her dead. Even after Thor would make some sense. Terrorists upset with the obvious show of religion standpoint. However, if they were after him, it meant they were after something of his. It could be his suit, due to their obvious mechanical curiosity, but what did he have that the others didn't? He spun, grabbing the lamp off the table next to him and pointing it at the window in his right hand while yanking the blinds back. Nothing. He prodded the window, swung it wide open even, and huffed in annoyance and chuckled lightly at how paranoid he was getting. God, I'm going insane. He muttered, moving to set the lamp down. Yes, I believe you so are right. He spun around, grasping the lamp tightly and pointing it at his invader as he recognized the smooth tone of voice, eyes narrowing as he noticed someone sitting at his table eating his food. Are you going to stand there, or sit down? I do not believe a light fixture will do much harm in this scenario. Loki mused, leaning against the chair back as he eyes Tony, who glared at him. Tony, who was feeling oddly suicidal, set the lamp down, walked over, sat down and stole said food Loki had previously been eating. Loki stared, arching one graceful eyebrow as Tony purposefully took a long, slow bite out of some sort of French pasta. Are you quite finished? He asked after a few seconds in a lengthy drawl, causing Tony to finish chewing and push the tray to the side with just enough force for it to waver on the point of falling off and not. Now, why aren't you locked up in Asgard with all your other friendly buddies? Tony asked, and Loki twitched ever so slightly, causing Tony to mentally cheer at getting somewhere. Why aren't I killing you yet and delivering your corpse to your residence in the land known as Nova Scotia? Loki returned, all kidding finished, as Tony sobered up almost immediately. How do you know about that place? He nearly growled, causing Loki to tilt his eyes and blink lazily. You spoke of it weeks ago while noticing me in an alleyway. He dryly stated, causing Tony to blink in confusion before eyes widening in understanding. Oh my God, you were a cat? He spoke, nearly laughing as Loki glared, causing him to try to hide his snickers. Yes, I was in feline form. However, I have a preposition for you, Loki stated calmly, and Tony very slowly made his way for one of his nearest drawers he knew held the kitchen knives. Oh, and why shouldn't I put on the suit at this moment and blow you all the way back to Asgard? Tony asked, slowly grabbing one of the nearest steak knives he could find. Because I know about SRP, he stated dryly, and Tony stiffened completely, and you can't get rid of me when I have information. And why shouldn't I just pry it out of you? Tony hissed in anger, his mind pestering him about what he could learn, what Loki probably knew that he didn't. Because I haven't attacked you. I could have killed you weeks ago and I didn't, he stated confidently, and Tony froze, because Loki could have. What do you want? Tony growled, and Loki blinked lazily. Define the question of your statement, Stark. Loki yawned, and Tony's hand clenched into a fist. What do you want from me? You're here for a reason, and I don't understand why you'd be here instead of with Thor. Tony barked, and Loki's eyes flashed in anger. Thor, he growled lowly, is a fool. I'd prefer the company of one with a higher intelligence than that of a toaster, he stated, and Tony resisted the urge to snort. Wait, intelligence. You said intelligence? Tony repeated in awe, mind quickly running at 1,000,000 miles an hour as he thought of other possibilities. Loki was silent as he watched Tony pace, mind wiring and speaking in hushed tones under his breath. The others weren't targeted because they aren't as smart as me, I'm a genius, but if the Dash and Loki started ignoring him, fancying the knife on the countertop, flipping it before catching it with ease as Tony ranted on. The monster was biological with mechanic properties, the mechanic properties was shoddy, CRP at best. But if they're chasing me they'd know that I'd noticed the mechanic properties, But the biologic had no way of actually working with the way the mechanics work. The biological creature was created by combining biologic abilities with magic. Stark. Loki spoke up, causing Tony to look at him in surprise. Magic? I don't believe in that hocus pocus. He froze, seeing the knife hover in midair before scowling at Loki, who had one eyebrow raised. The organization SCORP is creating weapons, you've noticed, yes? Loki added, causing Tony to give a nodding scowl. Wondering how he was having a civil conversation with said villain. They are attempting to mix mechanical properties with biologic weaponry. They are also attempting to cannibalize magic and create hybrid creatures. Loki scowled, speaking through gritted teeth towards the end. But you dashed. Tony's eyes widened as he whispered the words, causing Loki to give a dark and dry laugh. You see it now? He asked, amused, causing Tony to scowl, swiping his hands through the holographs in frustration, running a hand through his hair. I propose a temporary truce, extended until the organization of SCORP falls, or we fail. Loki stated, completely at ease with Tony looking at him warily. They caught you, didn't they? That's how they got that thing working. He stated, referring to the mechanic monster from months before, and Loki hesitated. Yes, I managed to destroy their base of operations and other experiments during my escape. I am willing to further allow you to investigate the area of said base. I am unaware if their research branched to further areas of Midgard. Loki stated, and Tony frowned. Probably did. Managed to drain you pretty good, huh? Tony muttered, and Loki scowled, flinging the knife with full force where it stabbed the wall strong, sinking halfway through the blade. I am not drained. Loki hissed, eyes flashing, but Tony gave a low chuckle. But you don't deny the fact they stole some off of you? What were you, some sort of magic cow? He asked. Loki hissed in wordless anger before rising, and Tony rolled his eyes. How dare you? You are lucky, Midgardian, that our little truce spares you. He spat, and Tony waved him off, pulling up a hologram. Yeah, I don't like you. You don't like me. Let's get this little truce thing in order and be a dear and point out the base? Are you sure? Just now silence yourself, you insufferable fool. Loki had been leading Tony in the blank forests for nearly 40 minutes, as kept track by Jarvis, who remained ever patient. I still don't see why you can't just turn all Edgar Allan Poe on me and fly ahead. Tony whined, and Loki shot him an exasperated look. I've told you, Stark. You flying behind is hardly inconspicuous. Then fly ahead and scout. Tony whined, and Loki rolled his eyes, knowing that a full-on battle would not end well. With Stark his odds were a little better. They trudged on, Tony constantly muttering under his breath as his feet sunk in fresh mud or slipped on a shallow puddle in tree roots. Loki froze, one arm lifted as he tensed, entire body ready to spring as Tony nervously shifted, and very slowly, Loki moved forward. His movements were lithe and cat-like as he weaved between enormous ferns with little to no sound. Large green eyes attentive as his face was expressionless. He murmured softly, Tony brushing a fern aside as he peeped out of the gap between two pine trees and his eyes widening at the sight of the nearly obliterated base. A huge crack split it into two halves, looking ironically like a split watermelon. How in the dash? Tony gaped, and Loki shifted, already weaving his way down the path towards the recent wreckage. Rudolph! Wait up, Tony shouted, hurrying down, and Loki's eyes narrowed, grabbing Tony, who ran to hurry up, before lifting him by his throat, fingers painfully constricting. Do not take this in any other way, Stark. You are only here to help me destroy this said organization. This does not allow you to give me any ridiculous names in such way of friendliness. Loki snapped before dropping the gasping Tony and continuing. The metal door had been yanked off the hinges, each of the bolts were melted into the floor, faintly resembling what they once were. Wow, massive heat to melt solid steel. Tony muttered, nudging the small remains of the heavy-duty bolts. The release of magic created a large friction surface. Bending and melting your puny metals are child's play. Loki scoffed, moving further into the building as Tony managed to feel slightly insulted. They walked on. After a while Loki held his palm out flat, managing to summon a small but very bright green flame, casting the halls in long shadows while Tony glared at the tiny dancing flame. "You know that is impossible," he mentioned, pointing to the flame while Loki scoffed. "Possibly by your sciences?" He rolled his eyes and Tony frowned. "Magic is science we don't understand yet." Tony shot off, having memorized the quote long ago. Loki's lips twitched ever so slightly as he let the flame dance across his fingertips. "Arthur C. Clarke. Good man," Loki mused, causing Tony to look at him with lifted eyebrows. "I find the fact you know who he is frankly disturbing." Tony blinked while Loki scoffed and rolled his eyes. "Do you take me for as much of an ignorant fool as Thor?" Loki asked, and casted Tony a look of slight exasperation. "Well, I don't doubt that you can operate a fridge, but Stark, I can cook a full holiday dinner, which includes homemade bread in one of your Midgardian contraptions. Oh, and Arthur C. Clarke, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic's." Loki quotes, walking at a much brusquer pace while Tony stared, slightly in awe. They walked on, and Tony glanced around before spotting a small yellow and black striped box. "Wait, I may be able to get power on, depending on how badly you destroyed this place," Tony muttered, walking over and prying the box open, frowning at some of the fraying circuits. Loki quietly walked over, remaining a distance to cast just enough light as Tony fiddled with the breaker, rerouting a few unimportant systems, like the alarm, to the lights and flipping the SWs. "Nothing. Great, just peachy. Looks like there is no enough juice to jump-start the system." Loki sighed, walking over and pressing his arm to the box, narrowing his eyes as suddenly the lights jumped alive with a few loud clicking noises. Loki withdrew, shaking his fingers to rid him of the flame as he noticed Tony scowling. "What?" he snapped, and Tony sighed, turning to walk away in the fluorescent lighting, looking for the main computer room. "The room that held the most intelligent of the foolish mortals is to the left," Loki drawled, and Tony sighed at the description. Guess he could not fix everything. They walked along. The steady sounds of his metallic footsteps and the near-silent ones of Loki made an odd mixture. Constantly, he would check to make sure the god had not vanished on him, although he expected it fully. He glanced back, and Loki was next to a door, apparently waiting to see how long it would take Tony to notice his absence. "You could have called," Tony muttered under his breath, approaching the door that apparently required a passcode. "Why didn't you just bust the door down?" Tony asked, and Loki narrowed his eyes, responding stiffly. "I'd prefer to use magical means only as a dire necessity." "What?" "Oh yes, sorry." Tony muttered, typing away on the small scanner with his large red fingers before Jarvis was able to override the lock, allowing the door to slide open. The room's lights flickered on, showing the multiple computers. A few had cracked monitors or screens flashing a multitude of colors, all stating in bold letters error. Mouses were strewn everywhere, and metallic contraptions were embedded in the walls. Few chairs appeared to be melted, and a wild disarray of gel pens had exploded, sending a rainbow of neon sticky ink to the closest chairs and coffee mugs. "You really wrecked this place," Tony murmured, moving towards a nearby computer and flicking the monitor on, already breaking through the field of code that surrounded the error screen. "Yes. I was one of the only options," Loki clarified, watching the lines and lines of words and numbers as he frowned, eyebrows scrunching down as the lines of code were slowly transformed into the access points required to get into files. Minutes passed and Tony continued to type away, Loki glancing around and watching the door at all times. "What's freaking you out, Reindeer Games?" Tony asked, having noticed Loki glance around continuously from his corner vision. "I will ignore the incorrect use of my name, and will not answer properly until you address me so," Loki huffed, causing Tony to roll his eyes. "Fine, what's got your knickers in a twist, Loki?" Loki's eyes narrowed, but he knew that was as close as he was going to get. "I sense another outside presence, but it fades and reappears before I can locate its whereabouts," Loki stated, and Tony froze. "You sure?" he asked, and Loki gave him a pointed look, as if asking, "Why would I tell you if I wasn't?" "Jarvis, scan our location and tell me if there's thermal increase in the vicinity," Tony ordered, the speaker in his ear beeping in agreement. You trust a sentiment machine to do your bidding? Loki asked, slightly repulsed while also slightly yearning to learn more. Machines are nice, they're predictable and do just as you want. Tony shrugged, and Loki was quiet a moment. I agree, mortals are too conflicted with emotions, which negate against logical choices on their part. What makes you so similar to those you share kinship with? These machines? Loki nodded to a computer, and Tony felt a slight pang of hurt, although he knew Loki did not mean it. Tony was silent, swallowing, and suddenly, the skin-tight metal of his suit was too cold, and it felt as if it was choking him, closing in on him. Logically, he knew that this was impossible. Logically, he knew that he was just disturbed by the statement. Mentally, he was hurt. Yeah, well, I guess some of us are different. Tony muttered, voice holding a little bite Loki took notice of and wisely remained quiet as Tony quickly scanned over the many files, eyes flickering across the pages and pages of data. There's too much here for me to look at, I'm going to have Jarvis copy it. Have a link on that thing yet? Tony asked, exposing a few circuits from his suit that Jarvis used to copy the mainframe down onto his software. It's jumping or vanishing. I'm unable to locate it, Loki stiffly stated as Tony nodded, and Loki cursed quietly, spinning and looking at the door. Tony turned, repulsors aimed at the opening while Loki held a mysteriously summoned dagger in one arm, ready to throw. It's gone. Loki growled, lowering the dagger while Tony let out a sigh of relief. He looked back at the computer, and Jarvis quickly detached, having gained everything he needed to. Okay, we're good here. Tony nodded, Loki moving towards the door as Tony followed. Loki moved, pausing in the doorway for a second before his hand tensed. What is Shkreeri? Tony spun, the thing already wailing loudly as a dagger protruded from the snout on his, shaking its metallic and fleshy head before snapping its head around, acid green eyes staring at Tony. You have got to be kidding me. Tony yelped, firing a repulsor blast, in which the thing snarled. I kid not, Stark. Loki growled, twirling a dagger as when Tony blinked, it was gone. Jarvis. Thermal imaging. Tony ordered, everything casted in cold blues and a dull purple, even Loki was a dull blue. He'd have to ask him about the Shkree. Tony grunted as a long tail smacked him, invisible on his radar, into the wall. Jarvis. Nothing has shown on thermal imaging, sir. Tony grunted, restoring his vision to normal as the pale gray thing made an odd chirping noise before snapping at Loki, who flashed his arm out fast enough with the dagger to form a long cut down its snout, a dull thud as it hit metal. Sir, it seems to be made entirely out of metal. Then why were you using thermal imaging? Tony cursed, jumping upwards fast enough to grab the long robotic dinosaur thing's tail and try his might to throw it. It squawked as it felt, claws scrabbling on the ground as it hit the sheet metal wall, plowing through while ripping up its skin as if it was tissue paper. Loki casted a glance to Tony, and gave him a slight nod before chasing after, movement too fluid to be called anything besides a dance. Jarvis, look through the databanks for some sort of info on that T-dash. It's gone. Loki growled, suddenly appearing in front of Tony, causing him to jump in surprise. What? Tony gasped, and Loki's eyes narrowed in anger towards that thing. Loki turned, breathing scathing comments under his breath as he looked at the wrecked hole and shaking his head, looking up and down the hallway. It's gone, it must have been one of the magically experimented creatures. Loki growled, making his way towards the wall. You think there's more of them? Tony asked, scanning along the walls while Loki exhaled lowly. It is highly likely. What is more likely is finding where the deactivation for these creatures are. Loki spoke, jumping through the crack, and looking towards the left before quietly making his way. Tony thudded after, looking everywhere in the shadowed corridor, ears pinpricked for the slightest sound. Sir. The results say the previous raptor was an attempt to reanimate a dinosaur known as an Utahraptor. One of the prime hunting theropod of its time. Loki, we're against one of the best hunting dinos. Huh, maybe you're as old as they are. Tony mused, looking around while Loki sighed. Stark, I am hardly. Loki's eyes widened and suddenly Tony heard it a moment before it attacked. It gurgled as Tony dropped back to the ground and sending a repulsor blast directly into the thing's throat. It groaned, jaw dropping with a creaking noise before falling, hitting the floor strong as sparks actually shot out of the large hole in which nearly decapitated the thing. Good? It's done? Tony breathed, mostly from surprise if anything. Loki walked over, looking at the thing before kicking it strong, knocking the head around so he could see it. No, this one doesn't have a wound on its muzzle. It's a different one. Loki sighed, turning and about to walk before he froze, looking back at the thing and approaching it warily. Loki? Tony tried but didn't move as Loki grabbed the thing's arms, yanking them apart and ripping the flesh all the way down its belly. Okay, what are you doing? Tony yelped, noticing how Loki was now yanking metal bits out of the thing's stomach. Loki stilled, a smirk flaring up on him as he removed something a cloudy white and pulsing green with many colors. Okay, what is that? Tony nearly shrieked, and Loki rose, carrying the large grapefruit-sized thing. Quartz rock, inside of it? Loki mused, hands constricting as the rock groaned and powder fell to the floor, cracking right now the side. Tony didn't muse on the god's strength, and instead watching in awe as the green light escaped, trailing upwards and piercing itself on Loki before vanishing, leaving no trace or mark. Magic? Tony whispered, and Loki's eyes met his and they moved, once again on march. X. It turned out that the other dinosaur was investigating outside, having found the crack in which Loki and Tony entered. It must have been released when the power turned on. Tony cursed, spotting the dagger protruding from its snout. And whose idea was it to turn it on? Loki hummed, lifting one eyebrow and looking at Tony, who scowled. And who was it who actually turned it on? Tony hummed, and Loki scowled, looking away. Back on Asgard, we have a word for this. Loki mused and Tony tilted his head. Here we say touché. You? Tony asked, noticing the grin Loki had. Bear. Loki spoke, obviously Old Norse, as it seemed elegant and slightly barbaric. Huh, that's fun to say. Tony blinked, trying it out on the tip of his tongue. Indeed. Loki agreed, looking around for the dinosaur, which seemed to have vanished. Where did it g-dash? Sesh cry. Tony yelped, rolling over and kicking upward, wincing as the long claw of the thing scratched over his suit, sparks flying as it snarled, long teeth and maw large enough to swallow his head. Loki was suddenly on its back, wielding a large pointed chunk of metal from one of the broken supports. The dinosaur screeched and howled as the pole found its way buried deep in the thing's back. It thrashed, and suddenly Loki was under it, craning its neck up, and he flipped, grabbing the throat and tugging. It collapsed, legs twitching as its neck and obviously metallic subroute was crushed. Tony breathed, looking at the thing as Loki did the same thing as before, freeing his magic from the belly of the beast and looking at Tony, eyes trailing the large gouge in the metal plating. It seems that a raptor's claw is the weakness of your metal shell. Loki mused, and Tony stared at the glistening claws, made out of some sort of metal. Break off a claw for me, will you? Tony groaned, and Loki shrugged, tugging and cracking the entire hand off from the metallic wrist, causing Tony to give him a dirty look, not that he would notice it. Tony grabbed it, twisting it and noticing the slight gleam before he clicked two of them together, seeing the sparks fly. Adamantium. In it. I thought they stopped making this a while ago. If I found enough I'd make an entire suit out of it. Tony muttered. It holds its own against? Loki pointed out, but Tony sighed, looking at the gouge. I can't just fix this with magic locks. It takes time. Tony groaned, and Loki looked at him odd. What did you call me? He asked, and Tony blinked. What? Locks? It's a nickname. Tony clarified while Loki looked amused and slightly annoyed. My name is 2 syllables, Stark. Well, not it's one. Tony bickered back, and Loki threw back his head and laughed. An honest laugh at how the bickering was so childish. Tony stared, a smile on his own lips, that is, until they finally touched ground and turned to start on the path they originally were on. The Avengers, in their proud and spandex-covered glory, stood in their path. Steve had his shield up, Thor with Mjolnir, and Clint with Natasha pointing a gun at his head. He blinked and looked at Loki, who was staring also. He was standing next to their number one enemy. But he was holding a hand to something. Admitted, it did look like it was ripped off, extra bad. It looked like he had not fought Loki. Double extra bad. He summed up everybody's thoughts quickly. Well, he drawled, attracting attention. DMN.